Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into The Fiction Wizard, presenting to you today, Madame Pomfrey's emergency scan during Year 1 found 62 loyalty potions and arrested Dumbledore live. Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1, The Scan. The broom had thrown him on the third pass. Not dramatically, no spinning arc through the autumn air, no crowd-gasping moment of spectacle. Harry had simply leaned too far left, chasing the updraft along the castle's eastern wall, overcorrected, and met the ground with his left shoulder at a speed that made his teeth click together hard enough to taste copper. He lay there for a moment in the wet grass, listening to the sky spin, while Neville made a sound somewhere above him like a distressed kettle. Harry, are you?" Madame Hooch said. "Not to, I'm fine." He wasn't entirely fine. His shoulder felt wrong in a specific way that suggested at least one thing had moved that shouldn't have. But he sat up anyway because the alternative was lying in the grass while 21st years stared at him, and he'd had enough of people staring at him in the last week to last several lifetimes. Madame Hooch crouched in front of him with the brisk efficiency of someone who had collected injured children for 30 years and felt no particular emotion about it anymore. Her yellow hawk eyes moved over him fast, professional. "Shoulder. It's fine, left shoulder," she said, as if he hadn't spoken. She ran 2 fingers along his collarbone with a pressure that made the world go briefly white at the edges. "That's dislocated. Possibly fractured. Don't be stupid, you're going to the hospital wing." The walk up to the castle took 10 minutes. Hooch conjured a sling with a flick of her wand and sent him with a second-year prefect named Calloway who walked very fast and clearly resented the assignment. Harry didn't mind. He spent the walk cataloging the ways his shoulder hurt, a useful exercise he'd found over the years. If you were paying attention to the specific quality of pain, you weren't panicking about it. The hospital wing smelled like lavender and something sharp underneath, medicinal in a way that wasn't unpleasant. Madame Pomfrey appeared from behind a curtained bed before he'd fully crossed the threshold, took one look at him, pointed at the nearest bed, and said, "Sit." He sat. She moved with the particular velocity of a healer who had learned long ago that hesitation cost more than speed. Her wand was already out, already beginning the diagnostic pass, the standard sweep that started at the crown and moved in slow measured arcs down toward the feet. Harry had been through this before. The summer before second year at his primary school, he'd broken 2 fingers in a door and the school nurse had done something vaguely similar with a penlight, though considerably less gracefully. The diagnostic spell was pale gold. It moved in neat rhythm, Pomfrey's face professionally neutral above it, her eyes tracking whatever information only she could read in the light's resonance. She paused at his shoulder. Made a small confirming sound. Moved on. She paused again at his chest. The sound she made this time was different. Harry looked up at her. Her face had changed, not dramatically, but enough. The professional neutrality had a crack in it, something sharp and very focused replacing it. "Lie back," she said quietly. "Is something, lie back, Mr. Potter." He lay back. She restarted the diagnostic from the beginning, and this time she wasn't going quickly. This time she moved with the deliberate care of someone who wanted to be absolutely certain about something before they said it out loud. The gold light deepened, pulled into a denser diagnostic frequency. Harry didn't know the technical name for it, but he could feel it differently, a low hum against his sternum like a tuning fork held too close. The light began producing colors. He couldn't read them. He didn't know what amber meant versus pale violet versus the deep, arterial red that bloomed around his midsection when the wand passed his solar plexus for the 3rd time. But he watched Pomfrey's face, and her face was doing something he hadn't seen an adult's face do in his direct presence before. She was furious. Not the sharp, performative fury of Uncle Vernon working himself up to a shouting point. Not the cold, disappointed fury of teachers who'd caught him doing something he hadn't actually done. This was quiet and still and absolute, like a wall of water before it falls. "Stay here," she said. "Madame Pomfrey, do not move from that bed." She was already at her office door. Your shoulder will wait. Everything will wait. The door closed behind her. Harry stared at the ceiling of the hospital wing, listening to the distant sounds of the castle, a door somewhere, voices, the peculiar settling groan that old stone made in afternoon wind. The diagnostic spell's residue still faintly lit the air around the bed, fading slowly the way embers do, going from gold to ghost pale to nothing. He thought about the colors. The amber that had clustered around his head. The red at his core. The pale violet at his hands and feet and the back of his neck. He thought about the way Pomfrey had restarted from the beginning. He thought about how she hadn't explained any of it. Behind the closed office door, Poppy Pomfrey stood very still for approximately 4 seconds, which was approximately 4 seconds longer than she usually permitted herself for stillness. Then she picked up a piece of parchment, wrote 6 words on it, folded it precisely, and pressed it to her Patronus. The wire-haired terrier that manifested from her wand in a burst of silver light, shook itself once as if testing the reality of its own pause, and then bolted through the office wall without waiting for further instruction. She had sent the Patronus to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Specifically to Amelia Bone's office, marked urgent, marked confidential, marked do not route through standard channels. Then she took out a second piece of parchment and began writing a detailed diagnostic record with the systematic precision of someone who knew that everything she wrote in the next 20 minutes might eventually be read aloud in front of the Wisengamot. She did not rush. She did not abbreviate. She wrote the time of initial scan, the presenting complaint, the accidental discovery that had occurred during what should have been a routine shoulder assessment, and then she wrote out every reading the diagnostic had produced, in order, with its corresponding magical signature cross-referenced against the potion classification codex she kept in the third drawer of her desk because she had spent 30 years expecting to need it and hoping she never would. She reached the line where she was required to write the total count. She wrote, 62 confirmed loyalty potion administrations. Residual compulsion architecture present across multiple neural and emotional magical centers. Oldest signature, approximately 10 years prior to date of scan. Most recent signature, within the last 18 months. She stared at what she'd written. Then she underlined it. Twice. She had been a healer for 32 years. She had treated unforgivable curse damage, dragon burns, experimental potion explosions, and a particularly creative incident involving a whomping willow and a second year who had deserved exactly what he got. She had seen dark magic leave its marks on human bodies in ways that still occasionally surfaced in her dreams. She had never, in 32 years, in every case she had documented, in all the dark magic she had catalogued and treated and testified about, she had never seen numbers like these. 62 administrations. Starting at approximately age 1. The child in her hospital wing had been systematically dosed with the darkest class of compulsion magic before he could form complete sentences. And the signature. God help her, the signature. Every potion left a trace of its maker, not a name, not a face, but a magical fingerprint as individual as any wand's resonance. Cross-reference that fingerprint against the ministry's registered magical practitioner database, and you got a name. She had cross-referenced. She had a name. She pressed her palm flat against the desk and breathed. Harry had begun, in Pomfrey's absence, to methodically test the range of motion in his dislocated shoulder, partly out of boredom and partly because 10 years of living in a house where medical attention was not enthusiastically offered had left him with a practical approach to his own injuries. The answer was, very little range of motion. Any attempt to rotate outward produced a sensation that he rated at approximately 8 out of 10 on his internal scale and which made his vision do something interesting at the edges. He stopped testing it. The wing was quiet. Late afternoon light came through the high windows at a long, amber angle, laying strips of gold across the stone floor. Outside, distantly, he could hear the sounds of the school settling into the hour before dinner, shouts from the courtyard, the rhythmic thud of someone practicing with a quaffle against a wall, a burst of laughter. Normal sounds. A normal school. He thought, not for the first time this week, about how strange it was to be here. How strange and how, not quite right, somehow. He didn't know what right felt like, precisely, having no strong reference for it. But there was something about Hogwarts that felt simultaneously like coming home and like walking onto a stage for a play he hadn't been given a script for. People looked at him. They looked at the scar and then looked at his face as if they expected to find something written there. He had started, by the end of the first week, to find this exhausting in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Ron had been decent about it, at least. Ron looked at him the same way he'd looked at him on the train, like Harry was a regular person who happened to have a famous scar, which was the correct way to look at someone and was apparently rarer than it ought to be. Hermione looked at him like he was a puzzle she was determined to solve before anyone else did. Neville looked at him like he was either going to save everyone or accidentally set something on fire, and was genuinely uncertain which. He was mid-thought about Neville's expression during the broom incident when the office door opened and Pomfrey returned, and she was not alone. The woman with her was perhaps 60, with a monocle and grey-streaked dark hair pulled back with no nonsense whatsoever. She wore lime-green ministry robes that had the specific air of robes worn frequently and practically rather than for show. She carried a leather satchel that clinked softly as she moved. Behind her came a younger man, perhaps 30, with a clipboard and the controlled expression of someone who had been trained to show nothing. "Harry," Pomfrey said, and he noticed that this was the first time today she'd used his first name. "This is Healer Brightwater from the Department of Magical Medical Oversight. And this is Horror Specialist Finch from the DMLE Forensic Potions Unit. They are here to," she paused. "Just briefly. To perform some additional diagnostic work. I need you to consent to that. You have the right to refuse." He looked at her. "Why would I refuse?" "Because you're 11 years old and I want to be very clear that this is your choice." "What will they find?" Pomfrey looked at him for a long moment with something in her face that might have been the beginning of grief, and he thought, very clearly, with a kind of crystalline certainty, whatever this is, it's bad. "Things that were done to you," she said. "Without your knowledge or consent." The room felt very still. "Then do it," Harry said. Healer Brightwater worked with methodical precision, running a full-spectrum analysis that took 45 minutes and required Harry to hold 3 different stances and drink a small vial of something that tasted of chalk and produced a brief sensation of warmth across his whole chest like swallowing sunlight. She did not narrate what she was finding as she found it. She simply worked, and her young colleague wrote on the clipboard with focused intensity, and Pomfrey stood at the foot of the bed with her arms folded and her face very carefully arranged. Harry watched the light from Brightwater's wand change colors the way he'd watched weather systems from the Dursleys' window when he was small and had nothing else to do, with a kind of patient, cataloguing attention. When she finished, Brightwater straightened, looked at her clipboard colleague, looked at Pomfrey, and then looked at Harry. "Mr. Potter," she said, "I'm going to explain what I found, and I need you to listen carefully and tell me if you have questions at any point." Her voice was precise and kind in the way of someone who delivered difficult news regularly and had made peace with the necessity of it. "Your body contains the residual signatures of a compulsion potion called Loyalty Brew. It's classified as a dark potion under Statute 14 of the Potion Regulation Act. It was administered to you repeatedly over a period of approximately 10 years. We've identified 62 distinct administrations." Harry said nothing. "This type of potion works progressively," she continued. "Each administration builds on the previous, reinforcing and deepening emotional compulsions. In layman's terms, it affects who you feel drawn to trust, who you feel compelled to defer to, and how you perceive people who act against certain established figures in your life. It suppresses independent assessment. It amplifies loyalty responses until they function closer to instinct than choice." "You're saying someone made me trust them," Harry said. His voice sounded normal. He was faintly surprised by this. "Yes. 62 times. The administrations increased in frequency between the ages of 7 and 9, Brightwater said. And there was a cluster of 3 in the 18 months immediately prior to today. Harry looked at the window. The amber light had shifted. Outside, the quaffle was still thudding against whatever wall it was being thrown against, and he thought about how extraordinary it was that the world was continuing to do completely ordinary things while he sat here being told that his entire emotional landscape had been constructed by someone else's hand. "Who?" he said. Brightwater glanced at Pomfrey. "We need to verify the signature independently before we," Finch began. "Who?" Harry's voice didn't rise. It didn't sharpen. It simply landed with a weight that made Finch stop mid-sentence. Pomfrey unfolded her arms and walked to the side of the bed and looked at him directly. She was not performing comfort. She was not softening anything. She was simply present and honest, and Harry found that he respected her tremendously in this moment. "The magical signature of the potions matches a registered practitioner in the Ministry database," she said. "It matches Albus Dumbledore." The quaffle hit the wall outside. Thud. 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 Harry looked at the hands folded in his lap and thought about the first time he'd met Dumbledore, the twinkling eyes, the half-moon glasses, the voice that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and ancient and certain. He thought about the way he'd felt, standing in front of the man, safe, somehow. Certain that this was someone who meant well. Certain, without examining why he was certain, that Dumbledore was good. He thought about how that certainty had arrived fully formed, like something installed rather than earned. "Okay," he said. Brightwater blinked. "Okay? What happens next?" It was not a question about what to do with his feelings. It was not a question about how he should process the information or whether there was someone he could talk to or any of the other follow-up architecture that adults like to build around difficult revelations. It was a direct logistical inquiry, and Pomfrey, who had spent 30 years around 11-year-olds, recognized the difference immediately and decided she liked this child enormously. "Next," she said, "we contact the Ministry formally, document everything officially, and bring in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." "They're already here," Harry said, looking at Finch. "We need the director," Finch said quietly. He glanced at his clipboard. "This is significantly above my authorization level." "Then get the director," Harry said. They fixed his shoulder at some point in the middle of all this, a potion and a charm and a grinding sensation followed by immediate relief, which Harry acknowledged with a brief nod and then returned to listening. Pomfrey had called 3 different ministry departments in 20 minutes. Finch had sent off 2 patron uses. Brightwater had begun a second independent documentation of her findings, writing in the red ink that Harry would later learn designated formal evidentiary records. By dinner time, the hospital wing contained 9 people. Harry was the only child among them. He sat on the bed with his repaired shoulder and ate the plate of food that Pomfrey had sent for from the kitchens, because she'd pointed out with the practicality of someone who had dealt with shock before that it was easier to think clearly when you weren't hungry. He was eating a bread roll and watching the adults organize themselves, the quiet efficiency of people performing a serious institutional function, parchments moving hand to hand, diagnostic records being copied and sealed, a small evidence containment charm being cast over the bed itself to preserve the magical residue for independent verification. He thought about Dumbledore, who was presumably at the head table in the Great Hall right now, eating dinner, perhaps pulling a sweet from that tin of lemon drops he'd mentioned when they'd first spoken in his office. He thought about what it would look like to a person looking in, a kindly old headmaster, beloved, decorated, the greatest wizard of the age, eating his dinner in peaceful authority. He thought about 62 potions and the 10 years they spanned and the fact that he couldn't trust a single emotional response he'd had in that entire period to belong to him rather than to whatever compulsion architecture had been built inside him without his permission. He took a bite of his bread roll. "Mr. Potter," said one of the ministry officials, a woman named Aldridge who had arrived 40 minutes ago and who wore the tight expression of someone bearing very bad news very carefully. "I need to ask you some questions. They may be uncomfortable." "Go ahead." She sat down across from him with a clipboard and a quick quotes quill that she held up briefly in question. He nodded. It began to write. When did you first meet Albus Dumbledore? September 1st, this year. He gave the welcome speech. He paused. Before that, I suppose he came to the Dursleys once when I was very small, but I don't remember it. My aunt told me. Have you ever been offered food or drink by Professor Dumbledore, or accepted something to eat or drink in his presence? Harry thought. He had lemon drops in his office when I went to meet him before term started. Did you have one? Harry opened his mouth to say no, and then stopped. He had. He'd taken one without thinking, without really deciding to, the way you take something when it's offered in a certain way. He had been 11 years old and nervous and meeting the headmaster and the tin had appeared and his hand had, yes, he said quietly. Aldridge wrote this down. The quick quotes quill scratched with deliberate precision. Prior to Hogwarts, can you think of any occasions when an older, authoritative figure in your life, a teacher, a community member, anyone, gave you food, drink or sweets that you didn't quite remember deciding to accept? And there it was. That was the question with the trapdoor in its floor. Because Harry thought about it properly, with the careful attention he'd given everything tonight, and began to find a pattern that he should not have been able to find, because it had been invisible to him until this moment, and it was only invisible because something inside him had been built to not look at it. There was the neighbor, Mrs. Figg, who gave him tea that always made him feel strangely calm and inclined to go home quietly and not ask questions. There was the school counselor in year 4 who had a jar of hard candies on her desk and who always seemed to know when Harry was close to asking the wrong question about his home life, and who always offered him one at exactly that moment. There was the church fete where a white-haired man in ordinary clothes had pressed a piece of cake into his hand and told him he looked hungry, and Harry had felt inexplicably, immediately better about absolutely everything. Yes, Harry said. Several times. Different people, different places. But it was always before I was about to say or do something. He looked up at Aldridge. Something that would have caused trouble for someone. The room had gone very quiet. How long have you known something was wrong? Pomfrey asked from across the room, and her voice was not professionally controlled anymore. Harry thought about it honestly. I didn't know. I just always felt like there was something I should be seeing that I wasn't. Like a word on the tip of your tongue. He set the bread roll down. I thought that was just what being me felt like. There was silence. Finch had stopped writing. Brightwater was looking at the middle distance. Aldridge's quick quotes quill had gone still, as if it too needed a moment. Well, Harry said, because someone needed to say something and the adults seemed to have temporarily lost the capacity, now I know. Pomfrey sent everyone but the essential documentation personnel out at 10 o'clock and made Harry lie in the bed and drink 2 potions, one for shock, which he didn't think he was in, but drank without argument because she had earned his cooperation tonight, and one to begin the slow process of clearing the compulsion residue, which she explained would take several months and required supervised administration. You'll feel different, she told him, sitting in the chair beside the bed in a way that suggested she intended to stay there. As it clears. Things that felt settled may feel uncertain. Loyalties that felt natural may need to be re-examined. It can be disorienting. Can it fix things that were actually mine? He asked. Not just the potion things. My actual feelings. Can it give those back? Pomfrey was quiet for a moment. It won't take anything that was genuinely yours. It will only clear what was added. She paused. That distinction will become clearer over time. But right now I can't tell the difference. Right now, she said, no. I'm sorry. He looked at the ceiling. High and stone and vaulted, the hospital wing ceiling was not the great hall ceiling that he'd walked into gasping on September 1st, but it had the same solidity, the sense of permanence, of a building that had stood for 1,000 years and expected to stand for 1,000 more. Does anyone else know? He asked. In the school? No. We sealed the wing when the ministry arrived. Standard evidence protocol. But it won't stay quiet. No, she said. It won't stay quiet. He thought about that. Dumbledore doesn't know, you know. Not yet. He's in the castle. Yes. Harry turned this over. The greatest wizard of the age, the man who had beaten Grindelwald, the architect, as it was increasingly apparent, of quite a significant portion of Harry Potter's inner life, was approximately 3 floors down eating lemon drops and presumably feeling entirely secure. Harry found he did not feel afraid of this. He examined the feeling carefully, prodded it for potion work, tried to determine whether the absence of fear was natural or manufactured. But it felt clean. It felt, actually, like the most genuinely his feeling he'd experienced all evening. He wasn't afraid of Dumbledore. He was, if anything, curious what the man's face was going to look like. When will the DMLE director come? He asked. Tomorrow morning, Pomfrey said. Amelia Bones. She's not someone who does things by halves. Good, Harry said. He closed his eyes. The potions were pulling warmly at the edges of his consciousness, and he let them. Neither am I. Outside, the castle settled into its nighttime sounds, the distant portrait murmur, the creak of old wood, somewhere far below the particular bass note of the lake's water against the dungeon stones. In the great hall, Harry imagined, dessert was being cleared. Prefects were shepherding first-years toward their dormitories. Dumbledore was perhaps thinking about the stone in the third-floor corridor, about his chess pieces, about the long game he had arranged with such care. He hadn't arranged for this. He hadn't arranged for Madame Hooch to send Harry Potter off a broomstick on a particular Tuesday afternoon in September, or for Madame Pomfrey to run a full-spectrum diagnostic instead of a targeted shoulder scan, or for 62 potions worth of evidence to bloom into visible color in the pale gold light of a routine healer's wand. He hadn't arranged for Poppy Pomfrey to be the kind of woman she was. Harry Potter fell asleep in the hospital wing with the calm of someone who had, for the first time in his memory, a problem he could actually see. The sealed door held. The evidence sat in its containment charms, detailed and irrefutable. In her office, Pomfrey wrote by the light of a single lamp, and the scratch of her quill was steady and relentless through the small hours of the morning. She wrote until she had written everything. Chapter 2, The Evidence. Amelia Bones arrived at 6:47 in the morning. Harry knew this because he was already awake, had been awake since 5, actually, lying in the hospital wing bed watching the windows lighten by degrees from black to gray to the particular blue-white of early autumn morning, and he heard her arrive. Not quietly. The flue in Pomfrey's office came alive with a sound like a contained thunderclap, and then there were footsteps with a specific quality to them, rapid and deliberate, the footsteps of someone who moved as if time were a finite resource and wasting it was a personal offense. The door between the office and the ward opened. Amelia Bones was not what Harry had assembled in his head during the night. He'd imagined someone ministry-shaped, formal, slightly removed, the institutional representative of a system he didn't know yet whether to trust. What he got was a woman who filled the doorway with a kind of practical authority that owed nothing to ceremony. She was perhaps mid-50s, built solidly, monocle catching the early light. She wore dark blue robes that had clearly been put on in a hurry, the left cuff was buttoned one hole off, and she carried a leather case that she set on the nearest available surface immediately upon entering, as if ready to begin work before she'd finished walking in. Behind her came 2 people Harry didn't know and one he recognized, Finch, from last night, who looked like he hadn't slept either. Bones looked at him. Not at the scar. At his face. Mr. Potter, she said. I'm Amelia Bones, Director of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I apologize for the early hour. I was already up, Harry said. Good. She looked at Pomfrey, who had emerged from her office with the composed exhaustion of someone who had mainlined strong tea and refused to acknowledge the night had happened. Poppy. Walk me through the original scan. Before that, Pomfrey said, and something in her voice made Bones pause, I want to establish ground rules. Bones raised an eyebrow. He is 11 years old, Pomfrey said, in the tone of someone establishing a fact for the record. He is the victim here. He answers questions on his terms, at his pace, and if at any point I determine the questioning is causing harm, it stops. Agreed? Bones studied her. Agreed. He also has the right to know everything we find as we find it. No keeping information from him for his own good. He's had quite enough of that. The word that landed with specific weight. Bones received it, nodded once, and turned back to Harry with an expression that had shifted slightly, still professional, still rapid, but with something added underneath. Something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition that this situation required a particular kind of careful. Agreed to that as well, Bones said. Mr. Potter, I'd like to start with the documentation from last night, then conduct my own scan for independent verification, then ask you some questions. How does that sound? Fine, Harry said. But I have questions too. I expect you do. We'll do this together. She clicked open the leather case. Finch, the containment status? Stable, Finch said, already moving toward the evidence containment field around Harry's bed. Signatures are preserved and cross-matched. I'd estimate we have a solid 72-hour window on the residue clarity. Then we have time to be thorough. Bones looked at Harry again with that direct, unperforming gaze. That's what we're going to be. Thorough. The independent scan took 20 minutes. Bones performed it herself rather than delegating, which Harry noted. She had the wand work of someone who had been a practical auror before she became an administrator, economical and precise, none of the flourish that Brightwater had employed. The light she produced was a colder blue than Pomfrey's gold, and it produced a visualization that Harry could see more clearly, a kind of translucent overlay of his own silhouette, lit in different colors in different places. He watched it with interest. You can see it? Bones said, not looking away from her work. The colors. I don't know what they mean. The amber clusters are the loyalty compulsion centers. There are, she paused. Moved the wand back over his head in a slow, rechecking arc, there are 7 distinct concentration points here alone. She continued down. The red at your core is what we call the anchor, that's the primary compulsion signature, the original administration. The older ones layer up differently to the newer ones. Newer ones are brighter. The oldest are almost. She chose her word carefully. Architectural. They've been there so long they've integrated. Harry looked at the overlay of himself, this map of what had been done inside him, glowing in someone else's colors. Integrated meaning what? Meaning the oldest ones have formed structural relationships with your own magical core. They don't sit on top of who you are. They've grown into the shape of you. Bones' voice was level, but her jaw was tight. Which is why the clearing treatment will take time. You can't simply pull them out. But they can be cleared. Yes. Flat, absolute. They can and will be cleared. Entirely. She completed the sweep, lowered her wand, and looked at him. 62 confirmed. My count matches Madame Pomfrey's. The magical fingerprint matches the ministry registration for Dumbledore, Harry said. Yes. He nodded. Looked at the overlay fading from the air. What's the legal classification? Bones blinked. Just slightly. Of what he did, Harry clarified. What law did it break and what does the penalty look like? There was a brief moment of recalibration around the room. Harry got the sense that people had been prepared for many things this morning and this particular question from an 11-year-old in a hospital bed had not been on the list. Administering a loyalty brew to a minor, Bones said, recovering, falls under Statute 14, Section 4 of the Potion Regulation Act, Dark Potion Administration. It also constitutes magical coercion under the 1877 Wizarding Persons Act, which is classified as a serious offense equivalent to a sustained imperius. And given the number of administrations and the span of time, the prosecution could additionally pursue a charge of intentional magical identity modification, which under current code carries, she paused, a sentence of no less than 15 years in Azkaban. The number sat in the air. Per charge, Finch said quietly, almost to himself, and then looked up as if he hadn't meant to say it aloud. Per charge, Bones confirmed. Harry did the arithmetic. 62 charges at 15 years minimum each was a number that didn't map onto any practical reality, but its size told him something about the seriousness of what had been done to him in a way that no one's careful tone had quite managed yet. "Okay," he said. "What do you need from me?" Pomfrey had sent for breakfast from the kitchens again, porridge and toast and a pot of tea that sat on the side table and received steady, grateful attention from everyone in the room. Bones' questions were methodical and she kept her word about the pace of them. She asked, Harry answered, she wrote, and if she needed clarification she asked cleanly without layering. The picture that emerged over the course of 2 hours was more extensive than even Pomfrey had known. The proxies. That was the part that Harry had to stop and sit with longest, when it was fully laid out. Because it hadn't just been Dumbledore administering the potion directly. The oldest signatures, the foundational ones from Harry's infancy and toddlerhood, had been administered by Dumbledore himself, but as Harry grew old enough to be somewhere that Dumbledore couldn't easily access without raising questions, a network of proxies had been used. Mrs. Figg. The strange quiet woman with the cats who had watched Harry since he was old enough to walk to her house alone. She had been given pre-prepared doses disguised as ordinary sweets and ordinary tea, and whether she'd known fully what she was administering or had been told it was something else, a calming potion, perhaps, for a difficult child, framed in whatever way made it acceptable, was a question that would require its own investigation. The school counselor. 3 administrations over 2 years. The church fate stranger, whose identity Bones made a note to trace. And one that Harry hadn't mentioned the night before, because he hadn't thought of it until Bones' questions dislodged it, the Hogwarts Express. The trolley witch. He'd bought chocolate frogs and Bertie Bott's every flavor beans with Ron, and Ron had offered him a bite of sandwich, and neither of those things had been the vehicle. But there'd been a small wrapped sweet pressed into his hand on the platform at King's Cross, by an older Hogwarts student he hadn't recognized, who'd said something cheerful about welcoming him to the school. Harry had eaten it without thinking. Bones made a note. Her face had been getting progressively tighter through the morning, not with emotion exactly but with the controlled tension of someone assembling a picture they were going to have strong professional feelings about. The platform administration suggests the network extends into the student body, she said to Finch. Or was staffed through it. She tapped her quill against the parchment. We'll need to identify that student. There's something else, Harry said. Everyone looked at him. He'd been thinking about this since around 3 in the morning, when he'd lain awake in the dark and let his memory run backward through his years at Privet Drive with the particular focus of someone who now had a reason to look at things he'd been built not to look at. The Dursleys, he said. My aunt and uncle. Pomfrey's expression changed. Harry, no, listen. I've been thinking about this. He kept his voice even. This wasn't about the Dursleys' behavior toward him, that was a whole separate architecture of grievance that he was not prepared to address in a room full of ministry officials at 7 in the morning. This was about pattern. They hate magic. They're terrified of it. My cousin told me once that my aunt screamed for an hour the first time she found out I'd accidentally done something magical. They locked up my owl. They locked up my things. He paused. But they never contacted anyone. Not the police, not anyone. They just kept doing what they were doing. And I was 11 years old and I never once tried to run away or tell a teacher at school or, he stopped. He dosed them too, Bones said. Did he? Harry asked. Or did he dose me into accepting the situation? Or both? Bones looked at him for a long moment. "You're suggesting the compliance ran in both directions." "I'm suggesting that a man who was careful enough to run a 10-year proxy administration network to keep me compliant probably didn't leave the other variable to chance." Harry picked up his tea. "I don't know. I can't prove it. But you could check them. Can you check people for residual signatures without them knowing? We can check anyone with their consent. Or with a court order." Bones was writing. "If what you're describing is accurate, if Vernon and Petunia Desley were also administered compulsion potions to ensure their compliance with housing you, then we are looking at a conspiracy with civilian participants that extends well beyond what I had anticipated walking in this door." "I know," Harry said. "How long have you been working this through?" Pomfrey asked quietly. "Since about 3 a.m. She looked at him. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some." He set down the tea. "I'm fine. What I'm not is going to stop thinking about it because it might upset people." Pomfrey made a sound that was not quite a laugh but had the architecture of one. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you are." The containment of information lasted until approximately 9:15 in the morning, which was when Minerva McGonagall knocked on the sealed hospital wing door. Harry heard the knock. He heard Pomfrey cross to the door and open it by 3 inches, and he heard the exchange in low voices, Pomfrey's carefully controlled, McGonagall's increasingly not. The words were indistinct through the ward but the tones were not. McGonagall's voice had the quality of someone who had found themselves outside a closed door that ought not to be closed and was experiencing the specific frustration of a person who was accustomed to being on the inside of things. He heard, several of her students unaccounted for at breakfast. He heard Pomfrey say, "Cannot discuss the nature of." He heard McGonagall say, "Harry Potter." And then the door opened wider and McGonagall was in the ward, and she stopped when she saw not just Harry in a hospital bed but 4 ministry officials surrounding him with parchments and evidence cases and the particular organized density of a formal investigation. Her eyes went from Harry to Bones and something in her face shifted, a rapid, intelligent reassessment. "Amelia," she said. "Not Director Bones. Not what's going on. Just the name, flat, in a voice that said she understood this was serious and she was not going to pretend otherwise." "Minerva," Bones said. "Close the door." McGonagall closed the door. She looked at Harry. "Are you injured?" "Shoulders fixed," Harry said. "That's actually not, it turns out the shoulder was the least of it." McGonagall's gaze moved to Pomfrey with a silent question that had years of professional relationship behind it. Pomfrey said, quietly but directly, "We found evidence of sustained dark potion administration. Loyalty brew. 62 confirmed administrations over 10 years. The color in McGonagall's face changed. Not dramatically, she was not someone who changed dramatically, but the shift was visible, like watching a stone crack along a line that was already there. "Who?" she said. Pomfrey looked at her. McGonagall looked back. Between them, the name was not said because it didn't need to be. Harry watched McGonagall's face and saw something he hadn't expected to see there, not shock, exactly, but the specific expression of someone receiving a confirmation of a fear they had refused to fully form. As if some part of her had known there was a door she hadn't opened and she'd kept herself from opening it and now someone had taken the door off its hinges and here was what was inside. She sat down in the chair nearest her. It was not a controlled, deliberate sitting down. It was the sit-down of someone whose knees had made a unilateral decision. "How long has this been documented?" she asked. "Since last night," Bones said. "We are still building the full picture. We'll be executing an arrest warrant today." McGonagall looked up. "Today?" "Yes." She stopped. Started again. "He's in the castle." "I know." The word arrest was sitting in the room now with a particular weight. Harry noticed that nobody was looking directly at anyone else except for Bones, who was looking at everyone with equal steadiness. He thought about Dumbledore 3 floors below, and about McGonagall's face right now, and about the difference between knowing someone had done something and watching the world restructure itself around that knowledge. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said. She looked at him. "I need you to not tell him," Harry said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't aggressive. It was direct and clear, and he watched her face as she absorbed it, the student she'd known for 1 week asking her to keep something from the man she'd worked beside for the better part of 40 years. She held his gaze. "I understand," she said finally. "I need to know you mean that." "Albus Dumbledore," she said, with a careful, measured precision, "has apparently been systematically administering dark potions to a child in my house for 10 years. Her voice was absolutely level in the way that things are level when they are being held level through significant effort. "I understand what that means. And I understand what my duty is." She looked at Bones. "Tell me what you need from me." The morning moved fast after that. McGonagall became, quietly and efficiently, the most useful person in the room. She knew the castle's rhythms, who would be where at what time, which staff members were close to Dumbledore and which were simply professional colleagues, which students were the most likely vectors for information spreading if anything was seen or overheard. She helped Bones map the operational window with the same crisp efficiency she brought to Transfiguration timetables, and Harry watched her do it and thought, she's grieving and she's working at the same time, and she's not letting the grief slow the work down. He respected that too. Bones had old for a formal arrest warrant at 8 o'clock. At 11, Finch received the confirmation, sealed, signed by the Chief Warlock of the Wisengamot's deputy in the Chief Warlock's unavoidable absence. Dumbledore himself held that position, which required the deputy authorization chain, which was one of several administrative complications that had consumed an extra hour of Finch's morning. The warrant was for Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, on charges of dark potion administration, magical coercion, and intentional magical identity modification. Harry held the warrant when Finch brought it in for Bones' review, because it happened to pass near him on its way across the room, and he simply held out a hand, and Finch, slightly startled, handed it over. He read it. All of it. Slowly, carefully. The language was formal and dense with legal terminology, but underneath all of it was a simple fact: what Dumbledore had done had a name, and the name was written down, and it had been written down by the proper authority, and there was no world now in which it could simply be made to go away quietly. He handed it back to Finch. "Good," he said. Finch looked at him. "Are you all right, Mr. Potter?" Harry thought about the question honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I think I will be." "Are you?" Finch blinked. "Am I? You look like you haven't slept and you've been in this room since last night." Harry looked at him. "This can't be easy work." Finch stopped. "No. It's not." He looked at the warrant in his hands. "I became an horror specialist because of what happened in the war. Dark magic on civilians. I wanted to be the person who documented it properly." He seemed to realize he was talking to an 11-year-old about his professional motivations and made a slight correction toward formality. "I'm sorry." Don't apologize," Harry said. "You're doing it properly. That matters." At 1:30, Bones called a pause. The morning had produced a formal evidence file that was now 6 inches thick in parchment, cross-referenced and sealed. It contained Pomfrey's original diagnostic record, the independent verification, the proxy administration timeline, Harry's full testimony from that morning, the cross-referenced ministry registration match, and a sub-file that Finch had compiled from a rapid search of historical aura records that had produced something unexpected: 2 prior anonymous reports, filed 11 and 8 years ago respectively, flagging concerns about the magical health of an unnamed minor child in connection with an unnamed senior ministry figure. Both reports had been quietly closed without investigation. Harry read about those 2 closed reports with a very specific feeling, something cold and clear that he decided to set aside for later, because later was when he would deal with feelings and now was when he would stay useful. Before we proceed to the arrest, Bones said, looking at Harry, I want you to understand what's about to happen in practical terms. Harry nodded. We are going to arrest Albus Dumbledore in a public setting, she said. Deliberately public. I want to be transparent about why. If this is done privately, removed to an office, handled quietly, there are significant institutional pressures that will immediately begin working to minimize, reframe, and potentially suppress what this investigation has found. Dumbledore has allies in every corner of the Ministry, the Wizengamot, and the press. A private arrest becomes a private story, becomes a managed narrative. She looked at him steadily. A public arrest, in front of witnesses who cannot be collectively silenced, becomes something else. A fact, Harry said. Yes. You want to do it in the Great Hall. She smiled. Just slightly. Dinner service begins at 6. Harry thought about it. He thought about the students, the noise, the tables full of people who had spent the last week looking at him. He thought about Dumbledore at the head table, in his seat, in his authority, in the comfortable certainty of someone whose long game had never been interrupted. I'll be there, Harry said. You don't have to be, McGonagall said. You can stay here. I know I don't have to be. Harry met her eyes. I'm going to be. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, with the precise, definitive quality of someone accepting a fact rather than granting permission. Then eat something first, Pomfrey said. Both of you. The afternoon had its own quieter work. Bones sent 2 of her people to retrieve the Ministry's records on Harry Potter's placement with the Dursleys, the original decision file, the magical protection assessment, all the documentation that should have required annual welfare checks and which, upon retrieval, revealed something that Finch brought to Harry at 4 o'clock looking specifically unhappy. The welfare checks were filed, he said. Annually. Signed and complete. Harry looked at him. Filed by whom? Dumbledore. He filed them himself. As Hogwarts headmaster and appointed guardian co-signatory. Finch laid the parchments on the bed. He has legal guardianship co-signatory status on your placement, Mr. Potter. It was established in 1981 when you were placed with the Dursleys. Harry looked at the parchments. He made himself my guardian. Co-signatory. It's a ministry designation that gives a named individual shared responsibility for a minor's welfare when no magical guardian is available. Finch was careful with his words. It also gives that individual the right to make certain decisions about the minor's care, education, and, in extraordinary circumstances, medical treatment. The room was very quiet. Including, Harry said slowly, decisions about what potions might be administered. Finch said nothing. He didn't have to. He made himself my legal guardian, Harry said, and used that position to legally authorize his own access to me. For 10 years. We're flagging that designation for immediate legal review, Bones said from across the room. It will be among the first orders of business at the Wizengamot. Harry looked at the documents, the careful, official paperwork, everything properly filed, properly signed, the welfare checks that had been filled out by the man who was supposed to be checked against. 62 potions. A decade. A network of proxies and a legal designation that made his access untouchable. Not improvised. Not opportunistic. Planned. He planned this before I could walk, Harry said. Nobody answered, because there was no answer available that made it better. He folded the parchments with careful hands and set them on the side table and sat very still for a moment. The afternoon light was getting long, going gold through the hospital wing windows. Dinner was in 2 hours. I want to understand something, he said finally. Not for the case. Just, I want to understand. He looked at Bones. Do you think he thought of himself as a villain? Bones tilted her head. What do you mean? When he was doing this? Setting it all up. The proxies, the legal designation, the potions. Harry's voice was even, genuinely curious. Do you think he sat down and thought I am going to do a terrible thing, or do you think he told himself a story about why it was necessary? Bones was quiet for a moment. In my experience, she said, the most dangerous people are always the ones who have the story. Harry nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. I thought so. At 5:45, Harry got dressed. Pomfrey had retrieved his school robes, which were clean and pressed, because apparently the castle's house elves had attended to them without being asked. He put them on in the small curtained dressing area beside the bed and stood for a moment looking at himself in the mirror, round glasses, dark hair going in 6 directions, the scar. The scar. He thought about the scar and Voldemort and the connection between them that the wizarding world had built an entire myth around. He thought about how much of the architecture of the last 10 years, the potions, the placement, the careful management of Harry Potter as a resource, had been constructed in service of a plan for a war that hadn't fully happened yet. He thought with the clear cold logic of someone who'd been thinking very carefully for many hours, positioned as a weapon. Not because Dumbledore didn't care about him, necessarily, he was genuinely uncertain about that, genuinely unable to tell through the fog of compulsion residue which of his memories of warmth toward the man were real and which were manufactured. But caring about a weapon and caring about a person were 2 different things, and somewhere in the last 10 years, one of those things had clearly dominated the other. He straightened his tie. Ready? Bones said from the doorway. He looked at his reflection once more. A boy in school robes who had spent 24 hours learning that he had been lived at rather than lived for. Yes, Harry said. And meant it. They walked out of the hospital wing together, Harry, Bones, McGonagall, Pomfrey, and Finch, and the doors closed behind them, and the castle's corridor stretched ahead in both directions, and the distant, familiar smell of the great hall's dinner drifted up from below. Harry put his hands in his pockets and walked. Chapter 3, The Arrest. The Great Hall at dinner was exactly what it always was. That was the thing Harry kept noticing as he walked down the marble staircase with Bones and McGonagall and the quiet file of ministry officials behind them. The castle didn't know. The enchanted ceiling showed a clear evening sky going from blue to the first pale purple of dusk, and the torches were lit in their brackets, and the smell of roast chicken and gravy moved through the corridors with the comfortable confidence of something that happened every night without fail. Students were streaming in from all directions, Ravenclaws from the east corridor, Hufflepuffs up from the kitchen's level, Gryffindors clattering down the staircases in clusters of noise and elbows. Ron Weasley spotted Harry at the entrance and changed trajectory immediately. "Where have you been? You weren't at breakfast and then Neville said you'd gone to the hospital wing and then nobody would tell us anything and Hermione's been, Ron." Harry stopped him with a hand on his arm. "I'm fine. I'll explain everything later. Tonight, I need you to sit down at the Gryffindor table and watch, and whatever happens, stay seated." Ron's ears went slightly red, which Harry had learned in 1 week was his tell for heightened alertness. "Whatever happens," Ron repeated. "Yeah. That's not a normal thing to say." "No," Harry agreed. "It isn't. Stay seated." He kept walking. Ron stared after him for a moment and then, because he was Ron Weasley and whatever else he was also fundamentally sensible, turned and went to sit down at the Gryffindor table. The head table was full. Dumbledore was in his chair at the center, half turned toward Professor Flitwick on his left, laughing at something. The laugh was what Harry fixed on as he and the ministry delegation entered through the side staff entrance and took positions near the wall. The laugh was genuine, warm and papery and old, the laugh of a man completely at ease in his own domain. Dumbledore had long fingers wrapped around a goblet of pumpkin juice and his eyes were bright behind the half-moon spectacles and he looked, in every visible detail, like a beloved grandfather at his own dinner table. Harry looked at him and felt the cold clarity he'd been carrying since last night settle into something even more precise. Bones had brought 6 people total. 2 Aurors in full uniform stood at the Great Hall's main doors, quietly, not conspicuously, but there. 2 more were at the staff entrance. Finch stood beside Harry with the evidence file. Bones herself stood 2 paces ahead, and she gave nothing away with her posture or her face. "Timing," she said quietly to McGonagall. McGonagall checked the time. 2 minutes. "The last students are still coming in. We wait until the hall is full." Harry understood why. Bones had explained it in the hospital wing, but seeing it now, the students filtering to their tables, the hum of conversation building, the normalcy of it, he understood it differently. Every person in this room was a witness. Not in the legal sense but in the human sense, people who would carry what they saw tonight in their actual memories, not in official documents, for the rest of their lives. You couldn't manage a memory the way you managed a press statement. "Harry." McGonagall's voice was very low. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "When this begins, you don't need to say anything. You don't need to be visible. You can stand here." "I know," he said. A pause. "But you're not going to." "No." She made the same sound Pomfrey had made, the almost laugh that acknowledged something clearly without quite approving of it. "The hat," she said quietly, "put you in Gryffindor for reasons." "Professor," Harry said, equally quiet, "the hat tried to put me in Slytherin." She looked at him then. Startled. "It talked about ambition and cunning and seeing opportunity," Harry said. "Then it put me in Gryffindor because I asked it to. Because I didn't want to go where the hat wanted to put me." He watched Dumbledore refill his goblet across the hall. "I wonder now if that was mine or the potion's." McGonagall was quiet for a long moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that a boy who spent the night working through a decade of manipulation with the strategic clarity of a trained investigator and arrived at dinner steady enough to reassure his friends is exactly where he belongs." Harry looked at her. She wasn't looking at him anymore, she was watching the doors, the students, doing her part of the operational picture. But the words had been offered with full intention, no performance in them, and he accepted them the same way. "Right," Bones said. The hall was full. The noise had settled into the comfortable roar of several hundred people doing the ordinary thing of eating dinner. "We go." She walked up the center of the great hall. Not around the edges. Not through the staff door. Up the center, between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables, with her 6 ministry people behind her and her leather case in her hand and her monocle catching the torchlight, and she walked like someone who had the right of way in every room she'd ever entered and intended to continue exercising it. The noise didn't stop immediately. It dropped in waves, table by table, as people noticed, first the Hufflepuffs nearest the door, then the Ravenclaws across the aisle, then a cascade of look and who's that and the sharp elbow-to-ribs communication that populated school dining halls. By the time Bones was 2/3 of the way up the hall, it was quiet enough that her footsteps were audible. At the head table, faces turned. Flitwick first, he had always been responsive to changes in room energy. Then Sprout. Then Snape, whose black eyes moved to the ministry uniforms and sharpened instantly. Then several others in sequence. Dumbledore was the last to turn. He did it slowly, which Harry noticed. Not the slow turn of someone who was afraid, but the slow turn of someone who had learned that deliberate movement conveyed authority. He turned, found Bones, and his expression did something that Harry watched with total attention. It cycled through, in approximately 1 second, recognition, calculation, and then the resettlement into benign welcome. "Amelia," Dumbledore said warmly, rising from his chair. "What an unexpected, Albus Dumbledore," Bones said. Her voice, Harry realized, had changed. Not louder, exactly, but projected, in the specific way of someone who had spent a career speaking in rooms that needed to hear them clearly. It carried to every corner of the hall without effort. "I am Director Amelia Bones of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I am here pursuant to Arrest Warrant 1991, A047, signed and sealed by the Deputy Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, on charges of dark potion administration under Statute 14 Section 4 of the Potion Regulation Act, magical coercion under the 1877 Wizarding Persons Act, and intentional magical identity modification under the Wizarding Criminal Code. She reached the end of the Gryffindor table, stopped, and held his gaze. "You are under arrest." The silence in the great hall was total. Not the absence of sound. The presence of held breath, 400 students and a dozen staff members all simultaneously in the state of having stopped. Dumbledore's face. Harry was watching Dumbledore's face. The benign welcome had cycled away and what was underneath was more interesting. Not panic. Not guilt in any recognizable flash. Something much more complicated, the expression of someone whose very long game had just encountered an unexpected obstacle, and who was rapidly determining the best response. "I see," Dumbledore said. He was still standing. He set his goblet down on the table with the deliberate calm of someone who intended every gesture to communicate something. "May I ask, the charges relate to the repeated administration of loyalty brew to a minor child over a period of approximately 10 years, Bones said. 62 confirmed administrations. The victim is currently 11 years old and is a student at this school." Every head in the hall turned. Not toward Dumbledore. Toward the student tables. Harry was standing at the side of the hall, and he let them look. He didn't move toward the center of the room, didn't position himself for drama, simply stood there in his school robes with his hands in his pockets and let the room work out what had been said and what it meant and who it was about. He watched the comprehension spread across the hall like a stone dropped in still water. The Gryffindor table. Ron's face, open, horrified, and then furiously angry in the specific way that meant he was someone worth knowing. Hermione, who had gone very white and very still and was reading the situation with the intensity of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just been asked to update. Neville, whose expression Harry couldn't quite read but whose hands were flat on the table in front of him with the steadiness of someone choosing not to react until he understood what he was reacting to. Dumbledore's eyes had found Harry. Harry looked back at him. There was nothing performed in it, no triumph, no challenge, no theatrics. Just looking, clearly, the way you looked at someone when you no longer had any reason not to see them plainly. Dumbledore's expression shifted. Something moved through it that might, in someone with less practiced control, have been grief. "Harry," he said. His voice was gentle and old and carried the resonance of someone who had spent decades being listened to by rooms full of people. "My dear boy, Mr. Dumbledore," Bones said, and her voice cut clean across his, "would advise you not to address the victim." Dumbledore looked at her. The gentleness reconfigured itself. "Amelia. You've clearly been given information that you believe to be, I've been given 62 documented administrations with your verified magical fingerprint on every single one." Bones took 2 steps closer to the head table. "I don't believe anything. I have evidence. You have the right to answer it in front of the Wisengamot." A pause. "You do not have the right to answer it here." Snape had risen from his chair. Harry watched Snape with the same attention he'd given Dumbledore, because Snape was interesting right now. His face was doing something complicated that moved faster than most people's faces moved. Reading Snape's reactions was like trying to catch weather. But Harry saw the moment that Snape understood the full scope of what had been said, and watched the black eyes move to him with an expression that was not sympathetic exactly but was, something. Something that acknowledged the territory of what this was in a way that surprised him. "Severus," Dumbledore said, and it was only one word but it had structure in it, "wait," a request that carried the particular authority of a man who had issued directives in shorthand for decades and expected them to be followed. Snape looked at Dumbledore. Then at Bones. Then, briefly, at Harry. He sat back down. Dumbledore's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Headmaster." Bones was at the end of the head table now, the 2 uniformed Aurors moving quietly into flanking position. "Please come with us." For a long moment, and it was a genuine moment, with actual weight in it, not theatrical. Dumbledore stood at his chair and looked at the hall. All of it. 400 students and a decade of carefully arranged pieces, and Harry thought that whatever story the man was telling himself right now, it was probably coherent and probably involved the greater good and probably contained, somewhere in its architecture, something that sounded like love. That was the part Harry found hardest and most necessary to hold at the same time. Then Dumbledore stepped away from his chair. He did not reach for his wand. He did not argue. He walked around the end of the head table with the dignity of someone who had decided that dignity was the only remaining available currency, and he stopped in front of Bones with 6 inches between them. "The school," he said, quietly now, too quietly for the room to hear, but Harry was close enough. "Who will run? The deputy headmistress will assume operational authority immediately," Bones said. "We've discussed it." Dumbledore looked past her. Found McGonagall, who was standing at the side of the hall with the posture of a woman holding herself together through the specific mechanism of absolute stillness. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Harry couldn't read it fully, it had too much history behind it, too many years of working partnership and genuine affection and whatever it was that made people both love someone and be devastated by what that person had done. He watched McGonagall's face and watched something in her that wanted to soften, and watched her not let it. She turned away first. Dumbledore blinked. And for just a moment, without the practiced control, without the twinkling authority and the benign patience of the greatest wizard of the age, he looked like a very old man who had just lost something he hadn't believed he could lose. Then the control came back, and he turned to Bones, and he said, "Lead the way." The hall stayed silent until they were through the main doors. Then it went very loud, very fast. Harry didn't move for a moment. He stood where he'd been standing and let the noise happen around him, hundreds of voices, questions, the scrape of benches as people turned to each other, the particular high pitch of younger students asking what had happened and the specific quality of older students' voices as they worked it out. He heard his own name moving through the room like a current. Ron was beside him in 45 seconds. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, and that was exactly right in a way that Harry didn't have immediate words for. Hermione appeared on his other side 30 seconds after that, with her arms folded and her jaw set and her eyes very bright. "Are you all right?" she said. It was technically a question, but it came out with the force of someone who had already decided they were not going to accept a dismissive answer. "I will be," Harry said. "What you said, the potion thing, that was you?" "That was, yes." She exhaled. Short and sharp. "Right." A pause. "For how long?" "Since before I could walk." She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Her arms tightened across her chest. "Then, I'm going to the library." Harry looked at her. "Now?" "I need to understand the mechanism. The potion, the legal framework, the Wisengamot process. I need to understand it properly." She said this the way other people said I need air. "Is that, I mean, unless you need, go," Harry said. "Come find me when you've got something." She nodded once and left at approximately the pace of someone who had been given permission to do the one thing they found genuinely comforting. Neville had made his way over as well, slower, with the careful movement of someone navigating a very loud room while thinking very hard about something else. He stopped in front of Harry and looked at him with that particular Neville expression, direct and honest and carrying something underneath it. "My mum and dad," Neville said. "They were Aurors. Before." He stopped. Tried again. People thought Dumbledore was looking out for them. "For me, afterward. Gran always said," he stopped again. His jaw worked. "Is it possible he did it to other people? The potion?" Harry looked at him carefully. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I think that question is worth asking." Neville nodded slowly. Something resolved in his face, not happily, but with the specific quality of someone who has named a thing they've been afraid to name and found that the naming, while not comfortable, was at least real. "Okay," Neville said. "Okay." He looked at the chaos of the hall, students everywhere, teachers trying to establish some order. "What do we do now?" "We eat dinner," Harry said. "Because Madame Pomfrey will know if I don't and she'll be unhappy about it." Ron let out a short, surprised laugh. The tension in his shoulders dropped about 2 inches. The three of them went and sat down. McGonagall called the hall to order within 10 minutes, which was impressive given the circumstances. She stood at the podium Dumbledore had vacated and she was, Harry thought, one of the most formidable things he'd ever seen, not because she was performing authority but because she simply had it, genuinely, in the bones of her. "You will have questions," she said, with a voice that cut through 400 conversations without apparent effort. "Those questions will be addressed in time, through the proper channels, with full transparency. What I will tell you tonight is this: the Ministry of Magic is conducting an official investigation, and that investigation is in competent hands." A pause. "In the meantime, this school remains open, your education continues, and you will conduct yourselves with the dignity that this institution expects." Another pause, slightly different in quality. "That will be all." She left the podium and the hall held for approximately 3 seconds before erupting again, but it was a different quality of eruption, less panic, more processing. McGonagall had successfully converted shock into something that could be sat with, which Harry suspected was one of the most underrated skills available to a teacher. He was working through his chicken when he became aware that he was being looked at. Not in the usual way, the glances at the scar, the weighing up that had characterized his first week. This was different. More direct, and more mixed. Some of it was sympathetic. Some of it was uncertain in a way that felt more like they didn't know what to do with the information than like they doubted him. One Slytherin 5th year 2 tables over was looking at him with open, calculating interest that had nothing hostile in it, more like genuine reassessment. And some faces, a small number, mostly among the older students, a few among the staff, had the particular closed expression of people who had heard something they didn't want to be true about someone they didn't want to stop trusting. Harry noted all of it and ate his chicken. "Draco Malfoy is staring at you," Ron said, through a mouthful of bread roll. "I know. Has been since before McGonagall spoke." "I know. What do you want to do about it?" Harry glanced across the hall. Malfoy was indeed looking at him, grey eyes sharp, the usual performative sneer absent, replaced with something that Harry suspected was the actual workings of an intelligent mind that had just received unexpected information and was deciding what to do with it. "Nothing," Harry said. "Not tonight." Ron accepted this. Hermione's empty seat between them had a small neat stack of books on it, retrieved during her brief return to deposit them before heading back to the library. Harry looked at the top one, Potion Law and Dark Magic Jurisprudence, 3rd edition. He smiled, just slightly. "She's going to read all of them tonight," Ron said. "Definitely. By morning she'll know more about it than the people prosecuting it." "Probably." Ron was quiet for a moment, pushing food around his plate. "What happens now?" "To Dumbledore?" "Wisengamot hearing," Harry said. "Probably within the month. He'll be held in ministry custody until then." "And the school?" "McGonagall runs it." Is that okay? For you?" Harry thought about McGonagall's face during the arrest, the grief she'd held with such controlled precision. Thought about her in the hospital wing this morning, seamlessly integrating herself into the operational picture. Thought about the way she'd said "I understand what my duty is" with her voice absolutely level and her whole being clearly in the process of a kind of heartbreak. "Yes," he said. "I think she might be exactly what the school needs right now." Ron nodded. And then, with the particular conversational gear shift of someone who trusted that big things were being handled and wanted to check in on the human part, "Are you actually all right?" "Not, I know you said you will be. But right now. Tonight." Harry set down his fork and thought about the question honestly. Right now, tonight, he felt like someone standing in a room after all the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. The room was the same room. The furniture was still there. But nothing was where his body had expected it to be, and the muscle memory for moving through it was temporarily unreliable. "I don't know what's mine yet," he said. "Of what I feel. The clearing treatment takes months. So right now everything has a question mark on it." He picked up his fork again. "But I know what happened. And I know it's being dealt with. And I know you're sitting next to me." He looked at Ron. "That last one feels like mine." Ron's ears went red. "Right," he said, very gruffly. "Good. Yes." Harry smiled and ate his dinner. After dinner, the castle did not settle. That was the accurate description of it, the normal post-dinner winding down, the movement toward common rooms and homework and the easy rhythms of a school evening, simply did not happen. Instead, clusters formed everywhere, staircase landings, corridor junctions, alcoves. Harry could feel the hum of it as he walked back toward Gryffindor Tower with Ron and Neville, hundreds of conversations about one thing, layering and cross-referencing and building an understanding collectively that no single person had yet managed individually. He passed Snape in the corridor on the third floor. Snape was alone, moving in the opposite direction with the quick black-robed efficiency that characterized all his movement, and for a moment Harry thought they would simply pass without incident. Then Snape stopped. Harry stopped. They looked at each other. Up close, Snape's face was doing the complicated thing again, the rapid cycle that was too fast to read fully but that Harry had now seen twice and had begun to develop a theory about. Snape was a man with a great deal of feeling that he had trained himself not to show, and trained himself so thoroughly that the feelings moved through him now like weather behind glass, visible in shape, not in temperature. "Potter," Snape said. "Professor." A silence that had several things in it. "The investigation," Snape said. He didn't finish the sentence. "Will be thorough," Harry said. "I'm told." "Yes." A pause. "Director Bones is not a person who does half measures." "So I hear." Another silence. Snape looked at him with those black eyes and Harry looked back and he thought, not for the first time, that there was something in Snape's relationship to Dumbledore that was more complicated than simple professional loyalty, that it had the quality of a thing built under its own kind of pressure, and that the events of tonight had rearranged something in it. "The clearing treatment," Snape said. "For the residual compulsion architecture." Harry waited. "The standard ministry-administered treatment is adequate," Snape said carefully. "However, if at any point the process produces complications, the architecture integrated into your core is not straightforward, there are more precise methodologies." He stopped. Seemed to be choosing words with unusual care. "Healer Pomfrey knows where to find me." It was not an apology. It was not an admission. It was the offering of a specific practical resource by a person who had, through some interior process Harry wasn't privy to, decided it was the appropriate thing to do. "Thank you," Harry said. Snape looked at him for one more moment, then moved on without another word, robes sweeping, the corridor absorbing him with its usual efficiency. Ron, who had been approximately 4 feet behind Harry for this exchange, came to stand beside him and watched the black robes disappear. "That was strange," he said. "Yes," Harry said. Was he being nice?" "I think so." "To you?" "Apparently." Ron thought about this. "The world has gone genuinely weird today," he said. "It was already weird," Harry said. "We just didn't know how." He went up to the dormitory at 9 and sat on his bed for a while. The other boys were still in the common room, the Gryffindor common room, he knew, would be buzzing for hours yet. He'd told Ron he was tired and Ron had accepted it without pushback, which was exactly right. He sat in the quiet and thought. Not with the frantic cataloging of the night before, when everything was new and sharp. More slowly. He thought about Dumbledore's face when McGonagall had turned away, that unguarded moment, the old man's control cracking. He thought about the story the man had been telling himself. He thought about the closed reports in the Auror file, filed 11 and 8 years ago by someone who had noticed something and tried to speak and been quietly shut down. He thought about his mother. Not with any specific grief, he had no memories of her, only photographs and second-hand accounts, and you couldn't properly grieve what you'd never had. But he thought about a woman who had died protecting him, and about how everything that had happened since had been managed by someone else's hands, and about whether she would have recognized it for what it was. He thought she would have. He pulled out a piece of parchment and a quill and wrote a single sentence. What else is there that I don't know yet? Not a question to answer tonight. A question to hold on to. A direction for the months ahead. He folded the parchment and put it in his trunk and lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling. Tomorrow there would be more ministry officials. More documentation. McGonagall would call an all-school meeting, probably. The press would have the story by morning. Bones had indicated that the ministry's press office would be making a controlled statement tonight, and controlled or not, the story would move fast. His name would be in the paper again. His scar would be the topic of the week. He felt, he noted carefully, no particular dread about this. He felt something that might be, if he was honest, something close to readiness. Below, the castle hummed with its thousands of ongoing things. Students talking, portraits gossiping, staircases moving, the lake breathing its cold breath against the dungeons. The hat in its cupboard. The stone on the 3rd floor, waiting. Harry Potter stared at the ceiling and breathed. Outside, in a ministry holding room somewhere in London, Albus Dumbledore sat with his hands folded and his half-moon glasses on and, Harry had absolutely no doubt about this, was already working on the next move. That was fine. So was Harry. Chapter 4, The Fallout. The Prophet hit Hogwarts at 6:53 in the morning. Harry knew the exact time because he was already at the Gryffindor table eating toast when the owls came in, not the usual morning trickle of Family Post but a wave, dense and purposeful, hundreds of owls dropping copies of the same paper across 4 tables simultaneously with the organized chaos of a planned delivery. The headline was visible from 10 feet away. He didn't need to reach for a copy to read it. Dumbledore arrested, Dark Potion Conspiracy against Boy WHO. Live Director Bones confirms 62-count charges. Hogwarts headmaster taken into ministry custody. The Great Hall did what it had done last night, only faster. The noise dropped to near silence as everyone read, and then rebuilt in a different key. Not shock this time. Processing had happened overnight. This was something closer to reckoning. Harry ate his toast. They used a photograph, Ron said, from beside him, holding up his copy. The photograph showed Dumbledore being walked out of the ministry entrance by 2 Aurors, his white beard and starry robes immediately recognizable, moving with the deliberate dignity he'd employed all the way from the head table. Even in photograph form, arrested and flanked, he managed to look like a man attending a ceremony rather than a man in custody. Of course they did, Harry said. How do you feel about your name being in the headline? About the same as every other time. Ron lowered the paper. Which is? Mildly irritated and not particularly surprised. Harry looked at the headline again. It's accurate, which is better than usual. Hermione arrived at the table looking like someone who had slept for approximately 3 hours and considered it adequate. She had a different paper under her arm, The Morning Warden, which was apparently a smaller publication that focused on Wisengamot proceedings and ministry law. She dropped it on the table next to Harry's plate and pointed at the top article without sitting down. The Deputy Chief Warlock has already filed for expedited hearing status, she said. That means the Wisengamot could convene within 3 weeks rather than the standard 2 months. And look at this, she pointed lower on the page, 2 members of the Wisengamot have already filed formal statements. Griselda Marchbanks says the charges represent, she read directly, an unprecedented abuse of the trust vested in the office of Hogwarts headmaster and a violation of the sacred duty of care owed to the students of this institution. Good, Harry said. There's also a statement from, well. Hermione's voice changed slightly. From someone called Lucius Malfoy, who says the arrest raises serious questions about ministry overreach and the rights of senior magical citizens. Of course there is, Ron said. Harry glanced across the hall to the Slytherin table. Draco Malfoy was reading the paper with his father's name in it, and his face was doing something that suggested the experience was not entirely comfortable. He felt Harry's gaze and looked up. The usual challenge wasn't there. He looked away first again. He did it yesterday too, Ron said, tracking Harry's attention. The looking away thing. I noticed. What does that mean? Harry thought about it. I don't know yet. But it means something. McGonagall called the all-school meeting at 9 o'clock in the Great Hall, with classes cancelled for the morning. She stood at the podium and she was, Harry searched for the right word and settled on exact. She was exact. Every word placed with the care of someone who had thought about this for most of the night and intended to be neither dishonest nor cruel about it. You have read the papers, she said. You have spent the last 12 hours in conversation about what you read and what you witnessed last night. I am not going to pretend that this is a simple matter or that I can resolve your questions with a single address. A pause. What I can do is give you facts. The Ministry of Magic has charged the former headmaster with 62 counts of dark potion administration, magical coercion, and intentional magical identity modification. The victim is a first-year student at this school. The charges are documented and evidenced. The former headmaster is in ministry custody pending a Wiesengemot hearing. The hall was absolutely still. This school will remain open, McGonagall continued. I will serve as acting headmistress until the Board of Governors and the ministry determine a formal appointment. Your education will continue without interruption. I want to be clear about something. She paused here, and something shifted slightly in her delivery, not the professional steel, but something underneath it, something human enough to be felt across 400 people. If any of you are struggling with what this means, if you trusted Professor Dumbledore, if you admired him, if this feels like a loss, those feelings are not wrong. Complicated feelings about complicated situations are appropriate. Another pause. What I ask is that those feelings not be directed at the student who is at the center of this. He did not choose this. He reported the truth and the ministry is acting on it. That is all any of us should be expected to do. She stepped away from the podium. A sound moved through the hall that wasn't quite applause and wasn't quite silence, something in between, something that acknowledged she had said something that needed saying. Harry looked at his hands in his lap and did not look at the students looking at him. Classes resumed at 11. Harry had potions. The walk down to the dungeons had a different texture now. Students moved around him differently, some closer than before, some further. A second-year Hufflepuff he didn't know said, "Hi, Harry," with the directness of someone who had made a deliberate decision about where they stood. A fourth-year Slytherin made a point of looking the other way. 2 Gryffindor girls from third year walked with him for a full corridor length without speaking, and somehow that was exactly right. The potions classroom smelled of sulfur and dried herbs. Snape was already there, standing at the front with his arms folded, watching the students file in with his usual flat assessment. Harry took a seat beside Ron in the second row. Snape did not begin the lesson for the first 2 minutes after the last student sat down. He simply stood and looked at the room, and the room became, through the specific mechanism of Severus Snape's regard, very quiet and very focused. Today, Snape said, we are making a calming draft. His voice was normal, the precise, measured cadence he used for teaching, stripped of inflection. This is not because the timing is ironic. This is because it is the next item on the syllabus and I do not rearrange syllabi for external events. A pause. Longbottom, do not look at the ceiling, this is not a weather forecast. Turn to page 47. Harry turned to page 47. Snape moved through the lesson with his usual rigorous economy. He corrected, occasionally with sharpness, he walked between the tables watching technique, he produced a correction to Seamus Finnegan's chopping that averted what would apparently have been a small explosion. He was, Harry thought, doing something deliberate, maintaining the absolute ordinary reality of the lesson against the extraordinary background of the day, and it was working. There was something grounding about Snape's complete refusal to acknowledge that the world had shifted. He came to Harry's table and looked at Harry's potion, a pale green that was approaching the correct pale green but wasn't quite there yet. "Your mint hasn't fully diffused," Snape said, with no particular inflection. "Counterclockwise. Twice. Then let it sit." "Thank you," Harry said. Snape looked at him for a half-second, then moved to the next table. Ron leaned sideways. "He's being normal to you," he said, in the whispered tone of someone reporting a genuine anomaly. "Normal Snape. Not terrible Snape." "Normal Snape is still fairly pointed," Harry said, stirring counterclockwise. "Yeah, but he's not, you know. He didn't say anything about your father." Harry hadn't noticed this until Ron said it. He turned it over. Snape had a habit, evidently, of making pointed comments about James Potter in Harry's presence. Ron had warned him about it on the train. Today he'd said nothing but "your mint hasn't fully diffused," which was simply the truth. Harry said. "What does that mean?" "Nothing yet." His potion had shifted to exactly the right pale green. "There. That's it." Defense against the dark arts was after lunch, and Quirrell was visibly flustered in a way that went beyond his usual nervous energy. He stuttered more than usual, dropped a textbook, and spent 10 minutes on a topic they'd already covered the previous week, which Hermione pointed out in the gentle but inexorable way she had, prompting a burst of stammering and a topic change. Harry watched Quirrell through the lens of the last 24 hours and thought about the layers of a castle, what you knew about the people in it and what you didn't, and how many versions of "I am not what I appear" could coexist in one building. He was thinking about this when the classroom door opened. The woman who entered was not anyone Harry had seen before, and she was not a student, and she was not ministry, at least not in ministry robes. She was perhaps 50, with the specific bearing of a journalist who had spent decades in rooms where she wasn't supposed to be and had developed an immunity to being asked to leave. She had a quick quotes quill behind one ear and a notepad in her hand, and she was looking at Harry with the bright, targeted expression of someone who had just located exactly what they came for. Quirrell made a sound like a distressed balloon. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," the woman said, in a voice that conveyed no actual sorrow whatsoever. "I'm Rita Skeeter, Daily Prophet. I was hoping for a word with—" "No," Harry said. She blinked. "I'm sorry." "No." He didn't raise his voice. He turned back to his textbook. "Professor Quirrell, were we on page 63? Yes, that is, Miss Skeeter, you cannot, I have authorization from the—" "You don't have authorization to access this classroom," Harry said, still not looking up. "And you don't have my permission to quote me, photograph me, or write about my private medical situation without consent. Those are my rights under the Wizarding Privacy Charter, Section 9. Madame Pomfrey informed me about them this morning." He turned a page. "If you'd like a statement, you can request one through Madame Bones at the DMLE. She handles press inquiries about active investigations." Silence. He looked up. Skeeter was staring at him with an expression that moved through several stages: surprise, irritation, recalculation, and landed on something that might have been grudging interest. "You're 11, she said. "Yes," Harry agreed. "And I've had a busy 24 hours. Page 63, Professor." Quirrell, to his credit, pointed at the door with a shaking hand and managed to make it authoritative enough to work. Skeeter retreated, not quickly, not with any pretense of embarrassment, but with the step-by-step withdrawal of someone filing the interaction away for future use. The door closed. The class exhaled collectively. Neville was looking at Harry with something that was specifically admiration, though he'd arranged his face to suggest he was merely reading his textbook. Ron was making no attempt to arrange his face at all. Section 9, Hermione murmured, from Harry's left. You actually read the materials Pomfrey gave you. I read everything she gave me, Harry said. There's a lot of it. Section 9 is particularly useful. You are going to be absolutely exhausting, she said, with a warmth that turned the sentence into something else entirely. The first stone was thrown at lunch. Not literally. A Slytherin fifth year named Marcus Bale, who had the specific energy of someone auditioning for authority he hadn't yet earned, sat down across from a group of second-year Gryffindors at the end of the Gryffindor table, some confusion of seating during the crowded post-meeting rush, and said, loudly enough to carry, my father says the whole thing is a ministry fabrication. Potter's probably lying for attention. The second-year Gryffindors went quiet with the caution of students who were small enough to be nervous. Harry, who was 3 seats away, did not look up from his food. Your father hasn't seen the evidence file, he said conversationally. When he does, he can form an opinion. Until then it's speculation. Bale looked at him. You think you're untouchable now? Because you got Dumbledore, I didn't get anyone, Harry said, still eating. I had a scan for a dislocated shoulder. The potions were already there. He looked up at Bale calmly. If you want to be angry about what the scan found, you're aiming in the wrong direction. Bale's face worked. He was 17, probably, and he had size on Harry and several years of Hogwarts social confidence, and none of that was useful right now because Harry was not afraid of him and was not performing not being afraid of him, and the difference between those two things was absolutely visible. You, Bale. The voice came from further down the table. Draco Malfoy had turned in his seat and was looking at the older Slytherin with the expression of someone who had decided how they were going to play something and was not inviting debate. Leave it. Bale looked at Malfoy. You're siding with, I'm telling you it looks bad, Malfoy said crisply. Arguing with a first year about a documented ministry investigation in the middle of lunch looks bad. Stop. Bale, after a moment that probably felt longer to him than to anyone watching, stood up and left. The table went back to its noise. Harry looked at Malfoy. Malfoy looked at him. The grey eyes were still calculating, but there was something else in them now, not warmth, not friendship, but a kind of acknowledgement. An admission that something had shifted in the geometry of things, and Malfoy was doing what Malfoy apparently did, which was position himself relative to that shift with as much intelligence as he could manage. Harry nodded once. Malfoy looked away. Did Draco Malfoy just defend you? Ron said. In a tone suggesting he might need to lie down. He defended his own social positioning, Harry said. It happened to benefit me. They're different things. You're 11, Ron said, with the weary affection of someone who was going to be saying this a lot. He went to see Pomfrey at 4 o'clock for the first clearing treatment. It was less dramatic than he'd expected. She had him sit in the hospital wing bed, his bed, it was beginning to feel like, which he had mild feelings about, and administered a potion that tasted of copper and something astringently green, like fresh-cut grass compressed to its essence. Then she cast a sequence of wand movements over his chest and head that produced a faint warmth and a sensation he could only describe as pressure releasing, very slowly, in places he hadn't known were pressurized. It didn't hurt. It felt, if anything, like the beginning of something. You'll have this every 3 days for the first month, she told him, making notes. Then weekly for 3 months. Then monthly until the signatures are fully cleared. The architectural ones in your core will be last. What will it feel like when they're gone? She considered. People describe it differently. Some say it feels like silence after noise. They hadn't noticed the noise because they'd never known anything else, and then suddenly it's gone. She paused. Some say it feels like color. Like things becoming more vivid. Another pause, more careful. And some say it's disorienting for a while. Because the compulsions had become part of how they understood themselves, and without them there's a period of relearning. Harry thought about this. The thing I noticed last night, the question of what's mine versus what was installed. Will that get clearer? Yes. Gradually. She capped her ink bottle. How are you managing it in the meantime? I'm treating everything as provisional, he said. If I feel something strongly, I note it but I don't act entirely on it yet. I wait to see if it holds. He looked at his hands. Except the things that feel clearly mine. Like, he searched for a way to say it, like waking up this morning knowing I was still going to deal with this. That's not the potion. That feels like mine. Pomfrey looked at him for a long moment. How did you arrive at that methodology? I don't know. It just seemed logical. Harry. She set down her quill. What I'm about to say is not medical advice. It is a personal observation. She looked at him steadily. You are doing something that trained adults find extremely difficult. You are responding to a systematic violation of your inner life with clear-headedness and appropriate action. That is, not normal. Not in a concerning way. I mean it is genuinely remarkable, and I do not use that word carefully. A brief pause. I wanted you to know I see that. Harry looked at the window. The afternoon was grey and going towards evening, the grounds below empty and wind moved. I spent 10 years not seeing what was wrong, he said. I'm not going to spend any more time not seeing. The magic started on Thursday. That was 3 days after the arrest, 2 days after the first clearing treatment, and Harry was in the middle of transfiguration when it happened. McGonagall had assigned them to turn a match into a needle, the standard first-year beginner work, requiring controlled intention and a specific wand motion. Most students were producing matches with vaguely metallic tips, which was apparently progress. Harry had done it properly on his first try on Monday, which McGonagall had noted with a sharp look and an approving nod. Today, he was half listening to the lesson while thinking about something Hermione had shown him at breakfast, a paragraph in a wizarding jurisprudence text about precedent cases for magical coercion charges, which had a brief footnote about suppression effects on victims' own magic. The footnote was 3 lines long and said only, in several documented cases of sustained loyalty brew administration, victims' independent magical expression was found to be significantly suppressed during the active compulsion period, recovering gradually with treatment. He was thinking about this, about what suppressed meant in practice, about what his magic looked like without 62 potions worth of interference, when he set the needle down on his desk and it vanished. Not transfigured. Not moved. Vanished, with a small clean pop, as if it had decided to stop existing. He looked at where it had been. McGonagall was beside his desk in approximately 4 seconds. She looked at the empty space. She looked at Harry. She picked up her wand and cast a locating charm that produced, from somewhere in the castle's general direction, a faint responding light about 70 feet away and 2 floors up. Your needle, she said carefully, is currently in the charms classroom. Harry looked at his hand. The match was still there, he'd never touched the needle after transforming it. I didn't try to do that, he said. No, McGonagall said. I observed that. She was doing her calculations face. Have you performed any uncontrolled magic in the last few days? Not that I noticed. Beginning today, I want you to keep a log. Any accidental or unexpected magical occurrence, the time and circumstances. She retrieved the needle via a simple summoning charm and set it back on his desk. This is not alarming, she added, with the precise care of someone who was actually slightly alarmed and wanted him to have the opposite experience. The clearing treatment is restoring access. Your core is recalibrating. It will normalize. What did it look like before? My core. With the potions. She paused. Compressed, she said after a moment. I had a conversation with Healer Brightwater this morning. She described it as a magical core that had been operating at perhaps 40% of its natural capacity. The number sat between them. 40%, Harry said. Yes. And now it's recalibrating. Yes. To what percentage? McGonagall looked at him for a moment with an expression that was in the territory of "I am not going to speculate about this in the middle of Transfiguration. We'll assess as the treatment progresses," she said. The needle vanished again. This time it reappeared on Harry's palm, from wherever it had gone, with a small pop and a faint warmth like something coming home. "Interesting," McGonagall said. "Sorry," Harry said. "Don't apologize. Log it." By Friday, 3 things had happened that Harry logged carefully. The first was accidental legilimency, or something in that territory. He was talking to Hermione in the library, and she was frustrated about something she wasn't saying, and without intending to he simply knew what it was. Not a vague impression. A specific knowledge. She was upset because 2 Slytherin girls had told her that her helping Harry was only because she was compelled by his fame, which implied that her own choices weren't hers, which had hit her in the particular place where Hermione Granger was most vulnerable. He knew this the way you know the answer to a maths problem that you worked without consciously running the steps. He looked at her. "They're wrong," he said, without preamble. She looked up. "What?" "Whatever they said, they're wrong. Your choices are yours. You read those books because that's who you are. That's not about me." She stared at him. "How did you?" "I don't entirely know," he said honestly. "I think something's changing. I'm logging it." He wrote it down in the small notebook McGonagall had given him. "Are you okay?" Yes. "How did you actually, the way you were holding your book," he said, which was not entirely true but was easier than "I think I just read your mind a bit" as a library table conversation. He'd examine the full truth of it later. The second was a protection response. He was walking past the 3rd-floor corridor, which he'd been told not to enter but had not been told not to walk past, when he felt what he could only describe as a push, a directional sense, not quite a sound, originating from somewhere behind the locked door. The same feeling you got when something large moved through water just out of sight. He stopped, catalogued it, wrote it down, kept walking. The third was fire. He was sitting alone in the common room at 11 at night after everyone else had gone to bed, rereading the evidence documentation that Bones had given him a copy of, and he needed to understand every piece of it, every charge, every line of the legal framework, and he would understand it, and his frustration at a particular passage he couldn't parse had produced, from his left hand resting on the armchair's arm, a ball of steady amber light about the size of an apple. It sat there for 10 seconds, warm and utterly quiet, before fading. He stared at his hand. Wrote it down. Did not feel afraid of it. Hermione found the precedent on Saturday morning. She came to breakfast already speaking, which was how Harry knew it was important. She normally required at least half a cup of tea before coherent speech, so the absence of that requirement indicated urgency. "There's a case from 1823, she said, dropping a book open to a flagged page onto the table. Wisengamot v. Caro, Elliot Caro, not the more recent family. He administered loyalty brew to a ward over 6 years. 41 doses. The Wisengamot found that the victim was entitled to a complete accounting of all decisions made on their behalf during the compulsion period, including guardianship decisions, property decisions, and, here, she pointed to a specific line, placement decisions. They ruled that the victim could challenge and overturn any decision made by the perpetrator on the victim's behalf during the compulsion period." Harry read the line. "Then read it again." "That means," he said carefully, "that I can challenge the decision to place me with the Dursleys." "Yes. And the guardianship co-signatory designation. And anything else Dumbledore decided for you." She sat down, finally reaching for her tea. "All of it can be reviewed and potentially reversed." Ron had gone still. "Where would you go?" he said. If the placement is reversed. Do you have other family? Harry thought about this. His parents were dead. His father's family, he'd looked into this at Hermione's prompting, was something he'd have to investigate properly. I don't know yet, he said. But that's a better problem than the one I had before. We should tell Bones, Hermione said. I'll write to her this morning. I'll help you draft it. I know you will, Harry said, and she smiled into her tea, and that felt, he noted it carefully, checked it for potion architecture, found it clear and solid, that felt genuinely good. On Sunday, Neville came to find him in the library. He sat down without preamble, pushed a piece of parchment across the table, and said, I old my gran. Harry looked at the parchment. It was a letter, returned, in the handwriting of someone who wrote quickly and precisely. He read it. Augusta Longbottom confirmed that Albus Dumbledore had been a regular visitor during the first 3 years of Neville's life. That he had, on 3 separate occasions, been alone with Neville while Augusta was in another part of the house. That there had been sweets on each occasion, pressed into a small child's hand by the most trusted man in the wizarding world. That Augusta had thought nothing of it. Harry set the parchment down. I want to be tested, Neville said. His voice was level but his hands were flat on the table. The diagnostic. I want to know. I'll ask Pomfrey, Harry said immediately. I might not be like you, Neville said. It might be nothing. But I need to know. Of course you do, Harry said. We'll go this afternoon. Neville nodded. Then, after a pause, if it's true. If he did it to me too. He looked at the table. My parents are in St. Mungo's. Have been since I was 15 months old. And everyone always said, he stopped. Harry waited. Everyone always said Dumbledore tried everything to help them and nothing worked. Neville's jaw was very tight. I want to know if that's true. The library was quiet around them. Hermione, who had heard this, had stopped pretending to read her book. Ron had set down his quill. We'll find out, Harry said. It wasn't a comfort. It was a commitment, and Neville received it as one. Pomfrey ran the diagnostic at 3 in the afternoon with a focused care that Harry recognized from his own first scan. She was thorough and she was silent throughout, and when she finished she sat down and looked at Neville with the expression of someone who had prepared for bad news and was delivering it with everything she had. For confirmed signatures, she said. Loyalty brew. The oldest dating to approximately age 2. Neville didn't move. Then he said, only 4. Only 4. He breathed. So not like Harry. No. The scope is significantly smaller. But, Pomfrey chose her words, they are positioned specifically. These administrations targeted your confidence response and your self-assessment architecture. The areas they affected were, she paused. Neville. The compulsion signatures map directly onto the regions that govern how you perceive your own capability. The room was very quiet. Harry thought about Neville Longbottom as he'd known him for 3 weeks, earnest, self-deprecating, certain he was the worst wizard in the year, flinching from his own magic as if he expected it to fail. He thought about a small boy given 4 doses of dark magic aimed precisely at his sense of himself. He thought about who had done it and why, and the answer that assembled itself was not comfortable. Neville, Harry thought, had been made to stay small. Kept manageable. Made certain, through the subtle architecture of compulsion, that he would never quite trust himself enough to become something unexpected. Because Neville Longbottom's other possible history, the boy who could have been the prophecy's subject instead of Harry, was not something Dumbledore's plan had any room for. Neville, Harry said. Neville was staring at the opposite wall with the expression of someone rearranging everything. Your magic is yours, Harry said. Whatever he took, whatever he suppressed, it's still there. Waiting. Neville turned and looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Not immediately hopeful, it was too freshly painful for that. But real. Present. Yeah, he said quietly. Okay. 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 He straightened in his chair, just slightly, in a way that cost him something and produced something too. What do we do first? Harry looked at Pomfrey. Then back at Neville. We do what we always do, he said. We document everything. And then we act on it. Outside the hospital wing windows, the Sunday afternoon was doing its slow descent into grey. The grounds were empty. The castle held its 1,000 ongoing lives in its old stone walls, and somewhere in London in a ministry holding room, Albus Dumbledore was presumably engaged in the careful construction of his defense. He had not, Harry thought, planned for 2 of them. Chapter 5, The hearing. The Wizengamot convened on a Tuesday. 3 weeks had passed since the arrest, and the castle had settled into something that wasn't quite normal but was at least stable, a new normal, built around McGonagall's brisk and unsentimental management of everything, around the DMLE officials who now came and went through the ministry flew in Pomfrey's office with the regularity of a timetable, around the particular hum of a school that had processed something enormous and was still processing it, quietly, in the background of every ordinary thing. Harry had continued going to class. He'd continued eating breakfast with Ron and Hermione and increasingly with Neville, who was 3 weeks into his own clearing treatment and already different in ways that were subtle and then not subtle. He'd corrected Seamus Finnegan's wand grip during a study session without apology, he'd answered a question in herbology before Hermione could, he'd stopped flinching when he walked into Snape's classroom. These were small things individually. Together they had the quality of a person growing back into their own shape. Harry had filled 6 pages of his notebook with logged magical incidents. The legilimency thing, Pomfrey had confirmed, carefully, that it was legilimency adjacent, that his natural empathic sensitivity had been suppressed by the compulsions and was now recovering, had happened 4 more times. The fire had happened twice more controlled each time, responsive to his intention rather than his frustration. The disappearing and reappearing objects had stopped once he'd started deliberately redirecting the energy elsewhere, which turned out to be a thing he could do by simply deciding to. Like flexing a muscle he'd had all along but never been able to fully access. McGonagall had sat with him for 2 hours one Tuesday evening reviewing the notebook. She had made her own notes in her own notebook. She had said, at the end of the session, that she was going to write to several people whose opinion she trusted about what the clearing treatment was revealing, and that he should not be alarmed by anything they found. He wasn't alarmed. He was, if anything, interested. The morning he was to appear before the Wizengamot, he got up at 5 and went for a walk. The grounds at 5 in the morning were cold and absolutely still, the grass grey with dew, the lake flat and dark like a held breath. He went alone. Pomfrey had extracted a promise that he wouldn't leave the castle grounds, not a restriction but a precaution, and he'd agreed without argument because the grounds were large and he wanted air, not distance. He walked along the lake's edge with his hands in his pockets and thought about Dumbledore. He'd thought about Dumbledore a great deal in 3 weeks. Not with the hot, unexamined feeling he'd had in the first days, which he'd treated as provisional, as he'd decided to treat everything, and which had not entirely clarified yet. But with genuine inquiry. He'd read everything he could find about the man, the history book said what history book said, all decorated triumph, the defeat of Grindelwald, the alchemy papers, the Wizengamot service. The people who knew him said more complicated things, Pomfrey's controlled fury, McGonagall's careful grief, Snape's glass wall weather. Bones, who had dealt with him professionally for 20 years, had said once, in a moment of unguarded honesty while they were going through documentation, "He is the most genuinely brilliant person I have ever encountered, and the experience of prosecuting him is one of the stranger things I will do in my career, because the brilliance is completely real and completely beside the point." Harry had thought about that for days. Brilliance beside the point. The capacity to be extraordinary in every measurable way and still cause the specific harm that came from deciding you knew better than everyone else what everyone else needed. He watched the lake and thought about how much of his inner life had been other people's decisions. And then he thought about the morning, about the Wisengamot chamber, which Hermione had described to him in extensive detail using 3 different reference sources, about the 50 members and the formal procedures and the witness protocols. About the fact that he would walk into that room and tell the truth about what had been done to him in front of the entire senior legal structure of Wizarding Britain. He was not afraid of this. He checked for potion work in the absence of fear and found none. It was simply the truth, he was not afraid. He was, he thought, watching the lake begin to lighten at its edges as the sky shifted, precisely the right person for this particular morning. Not because he was brave. Not because he was special. Because he had spent 10 years inside the cage and he was the one who knew exactly what it had looked like from the inside, and that knowledge was now the most useful thing he owned. He turned back toward the castle. Bones had arranged transport by ministry car, a perfectly ordinary black car that turned out to be not ordinary at all, capable of navigating central London at 30 miles an hour faster than the traffic flow by means of some enchantment that Harry didn't fully understand but that produced a pleasantly smooth experience. Pomfrey came with him. She had insisted on this at the planning meeting 2 weeks ago in a tone that admitted no counterargument, and Bones had agreed immediately. On Harry's other side sat Finch, now a familiar presence, with his clipboard replaced by a formal evidence satchel. McGonagall had wanted to come. Harry had seen it in her face at breakfast when he'd left, the contained want, the professional calculation against it. She was acting headmistress. The school needed her there more than he needed her at the hearing. She'd shaken his hand with both of hers instead, which told him something about the depth of what she was feeling that she wouldn't put into words. Neville had been in the entrance hall when Harry left. "Tell the truth slowly," Neville said. "That's what my gran says about giving testimony. People only have to interrupt you if you're rushing." Harry had looked at him. "You'll be okay today?" "Yeah." And Neville had meant it, Harry felt it, that particular empathic knowledge he was learning to trust, clean and certain. "I'm good. Go." Ron had been in the entrance hall too, in the background, in the manner of someone who had carefully positioned himself not to be in the way but not to be absent either, and when Harry passed him he said quietly, "Come back with something to celebrate." "Working on it," Harry said. The Ministry of Magic was larger underground than you'd expect. Harry had read about it, heard about it from Hermione and from Bones during the prep sessions, but the experience of arriving in the atrium, the soaring gold ceiling, the fountain of the magical brethren that he looked at with specific feelings he set aside for later, the rush of ministry workers moving with the purposeful haste of a large institution in full operation, was different from any description. People stopped when he walked through. Not dramatically. Not blocking the path or speaking. But the flow of the atrium changed around him the way water changes around a stone, brief eddies of stillness, heads turning, conversations pausing, the specific silence of a very large number of people simultaneously recognizing someone and managing their recognition. He walked through it with Pomfrey on one side and Finch on the other and Bones ahead, setting a pace that was not inviting delay. He looked at the fountain as he passed it. The wizard, the witch, the centaur, the goblin, the house elf, all in eternal frozen deference to the central figures. He thought about what it meant that this was the welcoming image of the Ministry of Magic. He thought about it and filed it away for later, in the same place he was filing quite a lot of things, the growing collection of things he intended to examine properly when he had time. They took a lift down to level 10. The Wisengamot chamber. It was smaller than he'd imagined and more oppressive than any description had managed. Circular, with tiered stone seating rising on all sides, the Wisengamot members already assembled in their plum-colored robes, 50 of them, which at first looked like a lot and then looked like exactly the right number to fill a room with the specific weight of institutional judgment. At the center, the witness chair, which had chains on the arms that Hermione had warned him about and which he looked at without particular concern. He was not going to be chained to a chair. He was an 11-year-old witness, not a defendant. The chains didn't move as he walked in, which confirmed this. He sat in the chair and put his hands on the armrests and looked up at the assembled Waisengemot and found that looking at 50 people looking at him was not significantly different from being looked at by 400 students in the Great Hall, which he'd done for 3 weeks. The scale was different. The weight was different. The fundamental act of being looked at was the same, and he'd had practice. At the high bench, the deputy chief warlock, a silver-haired witch named Millicent Bagnold, who had apparently served as minister for magic in the 80s and who had the dry, specific authority of someone who had survived more than one crisis of wizarding governance, called the session to order. "This is preliminary hearing 1991, A047, she said, regarding charges filed against the former headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. We will today hear testimony from the primary victim and from the lead investigator before proceeding to the formal charge reading." She looked down at Harry. "Mr. Potter. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" "Yes," Harry said. "Do you understand that your testimony will be recorded, and may be used in formal Waisengemot trial proceedings?" "Yes." "Are you here voluntarily and of sound mind?" He thought about the question as it deserved. "I'm in the middle of a clearing treatment for 62 compulsion potions," he said, "so I'd qualify sound mind as provisional. But I'm here voluntarily and I know what I'm saying." A murmur through the chamber. Bagnold looked at him with a sharpness that might have been approval. "Very well. Please state your name." "Harry James Potter." "Mr. Potter. Please tell the Waisengemot, in your own words and at your own pace, what you know about the events that led to these proceedings." He took a breath. And then he talked. He spoke for 47 minutes. He'd been told the average witness testimony was 15. He wasn't rushing, following Neville's advice, taking each thing in order, and there was simply a great deal of ground to cover. He started at the beginning, not at the broom incident, but genuinely at the beginning. He described Privet Drive not as a list of abuses but as a texture, a quality of life that built its picture through accumulation rather than individual incident. He described Mrs. Figg and the tea and the calm that had settled over him in her kitchen every time, and how wrong that calm had been, how it had never belonged to the situation. He described the school counselor's candy jar and the church fete and the older student on the platform and the lemon drop in Dumbledore's office. He described his first meeting with Dumbledore in detail, the feeling of safety that had arrived fully formed, the certainty of goodness that he'd never examined, because why would you examine a certainty? He described the way he'd felt about the man for the 3 weeks of term before the scan, a loyalty with no earned history behind it, a trust that had been there before he'd had any reason for it. He described the scan. Pomfrey's face. The colors. The number 62. He described the night in the hospital wing with the particular accuracy of someone who had spent 3 weeks rereading his own memories, Aldridge's questions, the proxy timeline, the guardianship co-signatory documents. He described the King's Cross suite and the way the memory had surfaced only under questioning, had been invisible to him until someone asked exactly the right question, and how that invisibility was itself a function of the compulsion architecture. He did not raise his voice. He did not cry. He did not perform anything. He simply said what had happened with the precision and steadiness of someone who had decided that the facts were more than sufficient on their own. When he finished, the chamber was quiet in a way that was different from the held-breath silence of an audience waiting for the next thing. It was the quiet of people who had received something and were sitting with it. Bagnold said, "Thank you, Mr. Potter." Her voice was careful. Members of the Waisengemot may direct questions to the witness. The questions came in waves. Most of them were fair, clarifying, specific, the questions of people who were trying to understand the full architecture of what had been done. He answered all of them directly and completely and without embellishment. 3 of them were not entirely fair. The first was from a Waisengemot member named Tiberius Ogden, who was perhaps 75 and had the air of a man who had built his world around certain unshakable certainties and was not finding the morning's proceedings comfortable. "Mr. Potter," Ogden said, with a careful neutrality that had edges showing underneath it, "you are 11 years old, and you are describing a conspiracy of considerable sophistication and duration. Is it possible that you have, in your understandable distress, attributed connections to events that are unconnected? That the proxy administrations you describe were in fact isolated coincidences that the investigation has assembled into a pattern? Harry looked at him. Are you asking whether I'm wrong, or whether I'm lying? A stir. I'm asking whether your interpretation of events might be. My interpretation is what the evidence shows, Harry said. Every proxy administration I described has been verified by the DMLE forensic team. The magical signature on all 62 potions is confirmed as Professor Dumbledore's. The guardianship co-signatory documentation is a matter of ministry record. If you'd like to argue against any specific piece of evidence, I'll do my best to address it. But I'm not going to accept the general suggestion that a child's testimony is less reliable than an adult's documentation when the child and the documentation say exactly the same thing. Ogden looked at him. Harry looked back. Ogden sat down. The second question was from a witch in the upper tiers named Dolores Umbridge, who wore a set of robes in a very specific shade of pink that Harry found he had an immediate and strong reaction to, instinctive, physical, the kind of response that sometimes arrived before analysis. He noted it. He noted it very carefully. The child, Umbridge said, in a sweet, soft voice like overripe fruit, has been subjected to quite a traumatic experience, and one does feel for him. But I wonder if the ministry might be acting prematurely? Albus Dumbledore has given 60 years of service to the wizarding world. Is it not possible that he had the child's best interests at heart, and that what appears on paper as, "No," Harry said. She blinked. I'm sorry. There is no version of administering dark compulsion potions to a child over 10 years that represents the child's best interests, Harry said. Having someone's best interests at heart and systematically removing their capacity for independent emotional response are not compatible things. If someone tells you they did a bad thing out of love, they may be sincere. They're still responsible for the bad thing. He paused. Your question wasn't really about whether he had good intentions, was it? It was about whether good intentions should affect the outcome of these proceedings. Umbridge's smile had a fixed quality to it. I was merely suggesting. I know what you were suggesting, Harry said. I answered the suggestion. The third question came from a member he didn't have a name for, younger, perhaps 40, with the specific careful expression of someone doing political calculation in real time. Mr. Potter, in terms of the schools, that is, regarding your ongoing attendance at Hogwarts, yes, I intend to keep attending, Harry said. The school is fine. McGonagall runs it well. I'm learning things. The member opened their mouth again. I'm not relocating to the ministry's care facility, Harry said. That was being discussed last week and I've already addressed it with Director Bones. I have legal counsel looking into the guardianship challenge under the Caro precedent. Until that resolves, I'm at school, which is where I belong. He paused. Any other questions about my living arrangements should be directed to my counsel. He had obtained legal counsel 4 days earlier. Hermione had researched the available options and circled 3 names. He'd old all 3 and kept the one who wrote back within 6 hours and led with "Here is the immediate legal landscape and here are your strongest options," rather than "How awful for you, let us know when you're ready." Her name was Catriona Walsh and she was 32 and she had the communication style of someone who expected to be in courtrooms for the rest of her life and intended to win in all of them. He liked her immediately. Bones took the stand after Harry was released. Harry sat beside Pomfrey in the witness gallery and watched Bones work through the evidence with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had built her career on the principle that facts, properly presented, were the most persuasive force available. She was in her element here, the detailed methodology of the investigation, the chain of evidence, the independent verification protocol, the subsidiary findings about the proxy network and the guardianship co-signatory abuse. She spent 12 minutes on the closed prior reports alone. The 2 anonymous complaints, filed 11 and 8 years ago, shut down without investigation. The chamber got very quiet during this section and stayed quiet. When she reached the section on Neville Longbottom, presented as a second minor victim identified in the course of the investigation without using his name, per a privacy protection that Bones had arranged, Harry felt several members of the Wizengamot receive this information in the specific way that people receive something that makes a picture larger than they'd prepared for. He watched them receive it. He watched Tiberius Ogden's face during this section. Something changed in it, slowly, through genuine effort, with the particular quality of a man who had held a position and was finding that the ground had moved under it. It wasn't conversion and it wasn't capitulation. It was something more honest than either. It was a person actually thinking, in real time, and producing a conclusion they hadn't started with. Harry noted this as well. They brought Dumbledore in at 2 o'clock. He came in without guards, they'd allowed him that dignity, and sat in the witness chair in grey robes that suited him, Harry thought, better than the usual magnificent stars and moons. He looked like himself. That was the extraordinary thing. He looked entirely like himself, the half-moon glasses, the white beard, the eyes that had something deep and quiet behind them. He looked like a man you trusted instinctively, and Harry sat in the gallery and felt the residual pull of that, the last architectural layers of the compulsion not yet cleared, faint now but present, the quality of installation in a loyalty he'd never chosen. He felt it and looked at it clearly and it had no power over him. Bagnold addressed Dumbledore with the careful formality of someone who had known him for decades and was not allowing that knowledge to soften the procedure. Albus Dumbledore. You have been charged with 62 counts of dark potion administration, magical coercion, and intentional magical identity modification. How do you respond to these charges? Dumbledore looked at Bagnold, and then his eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, to the gallery. Found Harry. Harry sat still and let himself be found. I do not deny them, Dumbledore said. The chamber erupted. Bagnold called for order twice before getting it. People were on their feet, not all of them, but enough. Voices overlapping. Ogden sat frozen. Umbridge's pink robes were standing up somewhere in the tiers, but Harry couldn't hear what she was saying over the general noise. When the chamber settled, Dumbledore continued. I do not deny the actions, he said, and his voice had the old resonance, the papery warmth, the weight of someone who had been listened to by rooms for 6 decades and understood how to use sound. What I ask is that the Wizengamot consider the context in which those actions were taken. The prophecy regarding Harry Potter, known to me since 1980, unknown to the wider wizarding world, indicated that the boy would be the only being capable of ending Voldemort. The nature of that confrontation required preparation. It required a specific emotional architecture. A boy who trusted the right people, who remained in place, who did not act independently before the correct moment. You built him, Harry said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The chamber was quiet enough that it carried perfectly. Bagnold looked at him. Mr. Potter, I'm sorry. I know the procedure. Harry kept his eyes on Dumbledore. But he should hear it said plainly, in this room, by me. He built me. He designed who I would trust and who I would defer to and what I would feel safe doing and what I would feel safe questioning. He arranged the shape of my inner life before I could speak in complete sentences. And then he called it preparation. He paused. I wanted him to hear what that is, from my side. Bagnold was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Dumbledore. You may continue. Dumbledore was looking at Harry. Something in his face had the quality of the unguarded moment in the Great Hall, the man underneath the performance, the grief that was genuine, the love that was also genuine, and the terrible coexistence of those things with what he'd done. You are right, Dumbledore said. In what you said. The framing was mine. The choices were mine. He looked at the Wizengamot. What I believed, what I still believe, is that Voldemort represents a danger that transcends the harm I did. That the cost of what I did was real and I do not minimize it. But the alternative, what was the alternative? Harry asked. Bagnall began to object. Harry kept going, because this was too important and she could rule on procedure afterwards. You had choices that you didn't take, Harry said. You could have told me about the prophecy when I was old enough to understand it. You could have prepared me honestly. You could have taught me instead of managing me. You chose this specific method. He held Dumbledore's gaze. I want to understand why. Not to forgive it. Just to understand. The chamber was absolutely still. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. Because I was afraid, he said finally. The words were almost quiet. A child who knew the truth of his situation would make his own choices. He might run. He might refuse. He might do the courageous and rational thing and decide that one child's life was not worth sacrificing to defeat one dark wizard. The half-moon glasses caught the chamber's light. I could not risk that. So I removed the choice. You removed me, Harry said. Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly. Yes. And you told yourself it was for the greater good. Yes. The same justification Grindelwald used. The chamber inhaled. Dumbledore opened his eyes. They were, Harry saw, very old and very tired and very clear. Yes, he said. I know. The recognition is, he stopped. I have had 3 weeks to sit with what I did and why I did it, and the recognition is not comfortable. He did not look away from Harry. I am sorry, Harry. For what that is worth. Harry looked at him. He sat with the apology, waited, looked for what it was and what it wasn't. It's something, he said finally. It isn't enough. But it's something. The Wisengamot deliberated for 4 hours. Harry waited with Pomfrey and Finch in a small side room with good tea and a window that looked onto a ministry courtyard. He read. He'd brought advanced potion theory because Hermione had told him it would give him context for the clearing treatment mechanism and she'd been right. He read for 3 hours and Pomfrey dozed in her chair and Finch organized his evidence files with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done his job well. At 6:15, Bagnall's assistant opened the door. They found Dumbledore guilty on all 62 counts of dark potion administration. Guilty on the coercion charges. Guilty on the identity modification charges. The deliberation on the proxy charges, accessory liability for the administrations carried out by Mrs. Figg and others, was deferred pending a subsidiary investigation that would take another month. The sentence was not passed today. That required a formal sentencing hearing with full Wisengamot assembly. But Bagnall, reading the guilty verdicts with the flat precision of someone who had read verdicts before and would read them again, added one non-standard statement at the end. The Wisengamot notes, she said, that the evidence presented today represents one of the most egregious abuses of guardianship authority documented in the history of this body. The fact that the perpetrator believed his actions to be justified does not mitigate the severity of what was done. It does not mitigate the decade of harm visited upon a child who deserved protection instead. She looked up from the parchment. This chamber will ensure that the full weight of our law is brought to bear. She closed the record. In the corridor outside the chamber, while Bones was speaking to the press in a holding room down the hall, Harry stood with Pomfrey and looked at the ministry ceiling. How do you feel? She asked. He thought about it properly. Like something finished, he said. Not everything. Just, this part. That's accurate. This was the evidentiary phase. There's still the sentencing, the proxy investigation, the guardianship challenge, I know. I mean this specific thing felt like it finished. He put his hands in his pockets. I said what I needed to say. He answered honestly. That part is done. Pomfrey looked at him. What will you do when it's all done? When the treatment is complete and the legal proceedings are resolved. He thought about it. He'd thought about versions of it, in the early morning walks and the late-night common room sessions. He thought about the stone on the third floor and the philosopher's stone in Dumbledore's careful arrangement and the thing Quirrell might or might not be moving toward. He thought about a world where Dumbledore's chess pieces were off the board and certain things that had been managed were now unmanaged. He thought about what he was becoming, the fire in his hand, the empathic knowledge, the needle that moved of its own accord, the magic recalibrating itself upward from 40% toward whatever it actually was. "I'm going to learn everything," he said. It was not a dramatic statement. It was a simple factual description of his intentions. Pomfrey smiled, not her professional smile, not her managing a difficult situation smile, but something genuine and a little fierce. "Good," she said. "Let's go home." They were in the ministry atrium, moving toward the exit, when Harry stopped. Bones was ahead with the press statement team. Pomfrey had gone to retrieve their coats from the visitor check-in. Finch was loading evidence into a security-sealed transport box. Harry was briefly alone in the flow of ministry workers going about their 6 o'clock business, and for a moment he simply stood in the middle of the atrium and felt the full weight of the day settling. 62 guilty verdicts. His own voice in that chamber, calm and clear. Dumbledore's face saying, "Because I was afraid." Something in the last architectural layer of the compulsion, the deepest installed loyalty, the oldest one that Brightwater had said was almost structural, gave way. Quietly. Without drama. The way a very old knot loosens when you finally find the right thread. It felt like silence after noise. It felt like color. He stood in the ministry atrium under its gold ceiling and felt, for the first time in his memory, that he could confidently call his own, entirely like himself. He didn't know yet what all of that meant. He didn't know the full shape of what he was becoming or what he was capable of or what the coming months and years would ask of him. But the question of who Harry Potter was, underneath everything that had been added and installed and managed, that question had, for the first time, space to be answered. By him. His own answer. He walked toward the exit, where Pomfrey was waiting with his coat and a look on her face that said she'd noticed the 2 seconds of stillness and was choosing to let it be what it was. Outside, London was doing its evening thing, dark and lit and moving, 10,000 lives proceeding in their ordinary extraordinary way. He put on his coat and breathed the night air and thought, now we find out. Chapter 6, The New Shape of Things. November came in like a door slamming. The first real cold arrived overnight between the 31st of October and the 1st of November, not the gradual autumn chill that had been building since September but the sudden committed cold of a season that had finished considering the matter. Harry woke to ice on the inside of the dormitory window, a thing he hadn't known could happen in a castle, and dressed in the grey pre-dawn while everyone else slept and went downstairs. The common room at 5 in the morning was his. He'd come to rely on this, the fire burning low from the previous night's last log, the portraits sleeping in their frames, the armchairs holding the warmth of the people who'd sat in them the night before. He made tea using the small kettle Hermione had installed on the side table after a vigorous 3-day argument with the house elves about the propriety of it, and sat in the largest armchair with his notebook and thought about the shape of the coming weeks. The sentencing hearing was in December. Catriona Walsh had oiled him twice in the last week with updates. The Wisengamot sentencing panel had been formally seated, the subsidiary proxy investigation had produced results that she described as significantly expanding the scope of accountability, and the guardianship challenge under the Caro precedent had been formally filed and accepted for review. She wrote in the crisp, information-dense style he'd come to appreciate, no emotional management attempted, just the landscape as it was. The proxy investigation had found, among other things, that Mrs. Figg had genuinely not known the full nature of what she'd been administering. She'd been told it was a calming compound, a licensed mild preparation used for anxious children. She'd been told by Dumbledore himself, with the full weight of his trust and authority behind the telling, that it was for Harry's benefit. Her cooperation with the investigation had been immediate and complete, and Walsh had indicated that charges against her were unlikely. Harry had mixed feelings about this that he was still working through. He sat with his tea and turned the feelings over. She'd still done it. She'd still given a child potions from a jar in her kitchen every time she watched him, without asking what they were or why a headmaster was providing them. Ignorance wasn't the same as innocence, but it wasn't the same as guilt either, and between those two things was a complicated territory he wasn't ready to map fully yet. He wrote in the notebook, "What do you do with people who did harm because they trusted someone they shouldn't have?" Different question from what you do with people who decided to harm. He looked at it. Added, "Both matter." Different answers. Outside the common room windows, the castle's grounds were dark and frost-white. The lake would have a thin skin of ice on its edges by morning. He'd walked it at 5 the day before and seen it beginning. He turned to a new page and wrote at the top, "What I know now that I didn't know in September." The list that followed took 12 minutes to write and covered both sides of the page and ran onto a third. He read it back. It was not a comfortable list. But every item on it was real, and real was what he decided to operate in, and so he read it to the end and closed the notebook and drank his tea. Neville came down at 5:30. This had started happening around week 4, Neville's internal clock shifting earlier as the clearing treatment progressed, as if his body was recalibrating its rhythms along with everything else. He dropped into the armchair across from Harry with his own cup of tea, took the first few minutes in comfortable silence, and said, "Gran wants to meet you." "Okay," Harry said. She's not easy." Neville looked at his cup. "She wanted to come to the Wisengamot hearing but I told her that was your thing and she should wait to be invited." That was good thinking. She didn't like it. A brief Neville smile, something that had become more frequent in the last 3 weeks, small and genuine and without the apologetic overlay it used to carry. But she respected it. "Tell her to come for the first Hogsmeade weekend. We can meet at the 3 Broomsticks." Neville looked up. "You'd do that?" "Why wouldn't I?" He looked at his tea. "I don't know. People are," he searched for the word. "Busy with you. Right now. You're a lot of people's main conversation. That doesn't make your grandmother less worth meeting." Harry looked at him. "Neville. What was done to you matters as much as what was done to me. Different scale, same principle. I don't want you thinking your situation is a footnote." Neville was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, "I went back to the herbology greenhouse yesterday after class and I stayed for 2 hours just working. Repotting things, trimming things. Sprout let me stay." He paused. "It felt good. It felt like mine. I didn't worry once about whether I was doing it wrong." Harry nodded. "That's new," Neville said. 2 months ago I'd have been apologizing to the plants." Harry smiled. "How are the Mimbulus Mimbletonia cuttings?" "Thriving," Neville said, with a specific warmth. Aggressively. They sat in the comfortable quiet and drank their tea while the castle lightened around them, and it was, Harry thought, genuinely one of the better mornings he could remember, which meant, given the provisional nature of his memories, that it was one of the better mornings he could confidently claim as his own. The guardianship hearing happened on a Wednesday, conducted via a ministry fluke connection in McGonagall's office rather than in person, Walsh appearing in the fireplace in crisp professional grey and moving through the proceedings with the systematic velocity Harry had come to expect from her. The Carrow precedent, Walsh explained to the Wisengamot review panel, 3 members in a small hearing room, not the full body, provided clear grounds for challenging the 1981 placement decision. The co-signatory designation had been used improperly as both a means of administering harm and a legal shield against challenge. The panel's job today was to determine whether the placement should be reviewed and whether emergency alternate guardianship arrangements were warranted pending the sentencing hearing. Harry sat in McGonagall's office and answered the panel's questions through the fluke connection with the same directness he'd used in the main chamber. Yes, he wanted the placement reviewed. No, he did not want to return to Privet Drive under any circumstances. Yes, he was aware that alternate arrangements would take time to formally establish. In the interim, Walsh said, at the point where the panel began discussing temporary arrangements, my client has an alternative to propose. Harry looked at McGonagall, who was sitting at her desk doing paperwork with the focused disinterest of someone who had been told to be present but not to listen. She wasn't not listening. Mr. Potter, the panel chair said. I'd like to stay at Hogwarts over the school holidays, Harry said. Under the acting headmistress's guardianship, if she's willing. McGonagall's quill stopped moving. That's a non-standard arrangement, the panel chair said. It's well within the Hogwarts headmistress's legal authority under the 1754 Educational Charter, Walsh said immediately. In cases where a minor student has no appropriate guardian available, the head of their educational institution can assume temporary guardianship. It's been done before. Professor McGonagall, the panel chair said, are you prepared to accept that responsibility? McGonagall set down her quill. Yes, she said. In a tone that suggested the question was barely worth the time it had taken to ask. Harry looked at her. She was looking at the flu connection with her usual precise expression, but her jaw had a quality he'd learned to read, the controlled version of something she was choosing not to show in a professional context. Thank you, he said quietly. She looked at him briefly. Don't thank me. Go somewhere else. I'm doing paperwork. He went and sat by the window and watched the grounds while the hearing concluded. The stone was becoming a problem. Not in the way it would have been under Dumbledore's arrangement, not the engineered progression toward a confrontation that Harry had been potioned into sleepwalking toward. But in the simpler, more practical sense that the thing behind the third-floor door was not as secure as everyone seemed to think, and Harry knew this because he'd worked it out. He'd been working it out for 2 weeks, in the spaces between everything else, with the methodical attention he gave to things that mattered. Hermione had accidentally contributed 3 pieces of information during separate library sessions, not knowing she was completing a picture. Neville had mentioned the 3-headed dog without realizing the significance. Ron had described the door in a way that placed its location on the mental map Harry had been building of the castle's defensive architecture. And Quirrell. He'd been watching Quirrell for weeks with the specific attention of someone who had learned not to trust comfortable explanations. Quirrell's nervous energy had a quality that shifted, in class, in the corridors, during meals. It was not consistent nervousness. It was strategic nervousness, he'd decided. The performance of an anxious person by someone who was something else underneath. The empathic knowledge he was developing didn't like Quirrell. That was the honest description of it. Every time Harry was in proximity, Quirrell's classroom, the corridors, once passing each other near the library, there was a quality to what he felt that was not just person who is nervous but person who is carrying something dark and it is very close to the surface. He'd written all of this in his notebook. He'd added it to the list of things he intended to act on. He'd also written down what he knew about the stone itself, the Philosopher's Stone, a thing he'd encountered first in a book Hermione had shown him in week 3 of term, during what she called background research on significant wizarding objects and what was actually her systematic investigation of everything that might be relevant to Harry's situation. He'd read the relevant passages. He'd thought about Flamel and the stone and immortality and who, in the current landscape of wizarding Britain with Dumbledore's chess pieces disrupted, might be motivated to seek it. The answer was not complicated. On a Thursday evening in the second week of November, he went to find McGonagall. She was in her office, as she usually was at 7 in the evening, working through the administrative mountain that being an acting headmistress apparently generated continuously. He knocked. She told him to come in. He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk, the chair that faced her, not the side chair, which she noted with a slight adjustment of her attention. "The Philosopher's Stone," he said. "It's in the castle." "I know it's here." McGonagall's face did something rapid and controlled. "Who told you?" "Nobody told me. I worked it out." He watched her. "I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm telling you what I know and I'm telling you that I think there's a problem with the current security arrangement and I'd like to help address it." "Harry, Quirrell," he said. She went very still. "I don't know exactly what he is," Harry said. "I know what he isn't, which is a nervous professor of defense against the dark arts who is genuinely uncertain about everything. The nervousness is a performance. Underneath it there's something that I can't fully identify yet, but that feels like it's getting more purposeful." He paused. "I know that without Dumbledore's oversight, the specific protective arrangements around the stone are compromised. I know that whoever set the remaining defenses in place, they were designed for a scenario where a certain level of oversight still existed." McGonagall looked at him for a long time. "You were 11 years old 2 months ago," she said. It wasn't a dismissal. It was something closer to awe, the contained version. "I'm still 11, Harry said. "I'm also apparently operating at significantly above 40% magical capacity now, and I've been systematically educating myself about everything that's relevant, and I'm telling you that I think someone needs to take this seriously." She stood up. "Come with me." They went to Pomfrey first, then Bones by Floo, then the three of them sat in McGonagall's office and mapped it out. Not a crisis meeting, calm, methodical, the laying of information onto a table and the consideration of options. Bones had been watching Quirrell. Harry was not surprised to learn this. She'd had a low-level surveillance in place since the arrest, because disrupted chess pieces created unpredictable dynamics, and she was not someone who ignored unpredictable dynamics. What she'd found had not been definitive, but it had been consistent with what Harry described. "What I want to know," Harry said, during the point where Bones was describing the surveillance findings, "is whether Voldemort is involved." The name in the room. Bones didn't flinch from it. McGonagall's expression tightened but held. "We believe," Bones said carefully, "that there may be a remnant presence. Something, non-corporeal, dependent. We don't have confirmation." "Is Quirrell the host?" Bones looked at him. "What makes you ask that specifically?" "The quality of what I feel from him," Harry said. "It's not one thing. It's layered. There's the performance and there's what's under the performance, and then there's something else under that, something older and colder, and it doesn't feel like it belongs to him." He looked at his hands. "It feels like a passenger." McGonagall made a sound that was not quite either of her sounds. "It was something new." "If that's accurate," Bones said, "then the situation around the stone is more urgent than our current assessment suggested." She looked at McGonagall. "The existing protections will slow him," McGonagall said. "But they were designed as a full gauntlet, not as a permanent barrier. They were designed to buy time for intervention." She paused. "The intervention that was planned was Dumbledore's." "Then we need a different plan," Harry said. "Yes," Bones said. "We do. I want to be part of it. Harry, not as the person who fixes everything. Not as the weapon in the plan." He said the word weapon cleanly, without venom, just as the accurate word. "As someone who has relevant capabilities and relevant information, and who has the right to participate in decisions about things that directly concern him." He looked at Bones. "You told me in the ministry that you believe in transparency. This directly concerns me." Bones looked at him for a moment. Then she opened her case and put a fresh piece of parchment on McGonagall's desk. "All right," she said. "Let's plan." The plan took shape over a week. It was not dramatic in its construction, not a single tense night of whispering, but a series of conversations, modifications, information exchanges. Harry contributed 3 things that the adults hadn't had: his knowledge of Quirrell's classroom behavior patterns, his empathic read of when Quirrell's baseline agitation was elevated versus normal, and his own magical capabilities, which McGonagall had now assessed formally and about which she had written 2 very careful letters to 2 very specific people whose opinions she trusted. Hermione contributed the logic puzzle solution in advance, sitting in the library with her eyes slightly glazed and a sheet of parchment covered in potion annotations, because she'd extrapolated enough of the gauntlet's structure from scattered references to reconstruct the final Chambers challenge. She handed Harry the solution on a Tuesday morning at breakfast as if she were returning a borrowed book. Worst case, she said, you'll need this. How did you know? I didn't. I suspected and I prepared. She picked up her pumpkin juice. That's what I do. Ron, when Harry eventually told him the broad shape of things, said, so what's my part? Chess, Harry said. Ron stared at him. Literally? Third task is a giant chess set. Harry looked at him. I need someone who can think 3 moves ahead and not panic when the board is actively hostile. Ron was quiet for exactly 1 second. Right, he said. Yeah. Okay. You don't have to, did I say I didn't want to? Ron looked at him with the direct, slightly exasperated expression of someone who had been trying to communicate I'm with you, obviously for 2 months and felt it shouldn't require this much explicit statement. Tell me when. The night it happened was a Saturday in late November, 2 weeks before the sentencing hearing, on an evening that had been completely ordinary until the moment it wasn't. Harry had gone to bed at 10. He'd woken at 1 in the morning with the empathic knowledge blazing, not subtle, not quiet, the way it had been building. Clear and loud as a bell. Something was moving through the castle with purpose and cold. He dressed in the dark, moved quietly, and in the corridor outside Gryffindor Tower ran directly into McGonagall, who was already there with her wand lit and her expression set. She looked at him. He looked at her. They both looked at the passage leading toward the 3rd-floor staircase. I've notified Bones, she said. 20 minutes. We don't have 20 minutes, Harry said. A pause. The castle around them was absolutely still. No, she said. I don't believe we do. They went. The 3rd-floor corridor was empty when they got there, but the door, the locked door, the forbidden door, was open. Not broken open. Opened, with a key that wasn't a key, the door hanging inward on darkness. He went through, Harry said. McGonagall looked at the door, then at him. Harry. I want you to know that you do not have to, I know. He looked at the darkness. Felt the cold beyond it, the passenger presence moving somewhere ahead, the familiar and unpleasant quality of something ancient and desperate. But I know this castle's gauntlet better than Quirrell does. I've been through it twice in practice runs. He looked at her. You set those up? Yes. She didn't apologize for the preparation. I did. Then I'm not going in unprepared. I'm going in knowing more than he does. He paused. Will you be there when I come back? I will be precisely here, she said, with a specific, fierce precision. He went through the door. The dog was asleep. Harry had known it would be, the harp had been set playing earlier, at his suggestion, as a precaution. He moved past it quickly and carefully and dropped through the trapdoor with the controlled descent of someone who had practiced this, landing cleanly and moving immediately. Devil's Snare retreated from his wand light without struggle. The Flying Keys chamber he crossed in under 3 minutes, broomstick and pattern recognition and the particular aerial instinct that had only improved since September. The chess set Ron had already mapped for him, the path through, the sacrifice positions, the optimal routing, he navigated on foot, and the pieces moved aside as if uncertain about a player who moved without playing. He wasn't playing. He was walking through someone else's board. The troll was unconscious. Someone had handled it already, which told him Quirrell had not come this way carefully, had blasted through, leaving evidence. He moved past the potions chamber. Hermione's solution in his pocket, cross-referenced against the actual bottles on the shelf. The flame ahead, the flame behind, the logical puzzle, solved in 4 minutes, correct bottle identified, drunk with the brisk efficiency of someone who had tested the solution twice. The cold hit him like a wall when he went through. The mirror of Eriste stood in the final chamber, and Quirrell stood before it with his back to Harry, and for a moment the scene had the quality of something that had been waiting, the specific stillness of a confrontation that both participants had known was coming. You, Quirrell said. He turned. His voice was not his performance voice, no stammer, no nervous energy. Flat and controlled. The performance entirely discarded because there was no audience left to perform for. Yes, Harry said. The turban. He looked at the turban and felt the passenger presence concentrated there, sharp and cold and old and furious at being reduced to this, to haunting the back of a man's head, to dependency, to the long and humiliating route back from almost death. Step aside, Quirrell said. No. I will not ask twice. I know. Harry looked at the mirror. He could see himself in it, clearly, directly, without the compulsion architecture that would have distorted his reflection 2 months ago. Himself. Simply himself. In one hand of his reflected self was the stone, small and red and warm-looking. As he looked at it, he felt it appear in his actual hand, solid and real, moved there by the mirror's particular logic. He closed his fingers around it without looking away from Quirrell. I know what you want. I'm not giving it to you. Quirrell's wand was up. You are a child. Yes, Harry said. A child who knows you're not all that's in that body, and who knows that what you're carrying is weakened to the point where the plan you're attempting has significant gaps in it. He looked at the turban. You couldn't do this in September. You couldn't do it in October. You're running out of time. The temperature in the room dropped further. When Voldemort spoke, it was not Quirrell's mouth, it was the other face, the one Harry felt rather than fully saw, the passenger pressing forward. You would do well, it said, in a voice like wine through broken glass, to remember who I am. I know who you are, Harry said. You're the reason someone decided I needed to be managed from birth. You're the reason 62 potions exist in the documentation of what was done to me. He felt the stone warm in his fist. You've already cost me enough. You don't get the stone. Give it to me, Voldemort said, and I will give you your parents. I can bring them back. I have power that, no you can't, Harry said. And I wouldn't make that trade if you could. He held the man who carried Voldemort's gaze. Quirrell. I know you're in there. I know you chose this and I know why and I know that the choice has cost you things. But this ends here. He raised his hand and placed it against Quirrell's face. He hadn't planned it as a deliberate strategy. He'd read about the effect, from a fragment in Pomfrey's medical files, cross-referenced against a dark magic treatise Hermione had found, that Voldemort's half-life remnant state could not tolerate direct contact with certain magical signatures, that the specific magic of a sacrificial protection was anathema to his degraded form. He'd thought about it. He'd wondered if his mother's protection, embedded in him since infancy, had survived the compulsion suppression. Apparently it had. The contact was catastrophic for Quirrell. Not slow, immediate, volcanic, the dark magic burning against something it had no defense for, the passenger screaming in a register that Harry felt in his chest rather than heard with his ears. He held on. It hurt. He held on anyway, with the same calm that had gotten him through the Wisengamot chamber and the hospital wing and every morning of the last 2 months, the calm of someone who had decided that what needed doing without hesitation or performance. Quirrell collapsed. The passenger presence fragmented, he felt it go, felt the room's temperature surge back toward normal, felt the cold thing that had been in the room dissolve like smoke in wind. Not destroyed. Not finally. But driven out, dispersed, sent back to whatever marginal existence it maintained between attempts. Harry stood in the final chamber with the stone in his hand and his breathing elevated and his knees doing something that suggested they were reconsidering their structural commitments, and he thought, this was going to happen one way or another. Better now than in 5 years' time, on someone else's terms. He pocketed the stone and looked at Quirrell, crumpled at the base of the mirror. Alive, barely, the dark magic's departure having taken something vital with it. He pulled out his wand and sent up the brightest light he could manage, because McGonagall was somewhere above with the Ministry 20 minutes behind her and he needed them to know he'd been down here. McGonagall came through the trapdoor 4 minutes later. She assessed the room in approximately 3 seconds: Quirrell on the floor, Harry standing, the mirror, the absence of any other presence, and then she crossed the room and put one hand on Harry's shoulder and said nothing for a moment. He let her. Then he held out the stone. She looked at it. Looked at him. Looked at it again. "You found it in the mirror," she said. "Yes. Because you wanted to find it, not to use it." "Yes." She took the stone from him and pocketed it with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something both precious and dangerous. Then she said, "Are you hurt?" "My hand is." He looked at his right hand. The contact with Quirrell had left something, not a wound exactly but a rawness, the magical equivalent of a burn. "It'll need Pomfrey." "Everything needs Pomfrey," she said, with the faint exhaustion of someone who had been saying this since September and expected to be saying it for several years. "Can you walk?" "Obviously." "Then walk." She conjured a stretcher for Quirrell and levitated him ahead as they went back through the chambers, and Harry walked beside her through the Devil's Snare and the Keys room and past the sleeping dog and up through the trapdoor and along the third-floor corridor, and when they came out into the lit hallway of the castle McGonagall stopped and faced him properly for the first time since they'd parted at the door. "You could have waited," she said. "Bones was 20 minutes away. We could have gone together." "He was at the mirror," Harry said. 20 minutes and the stone was gone. She looked at him. "I'm not apologizing," he said. "I was the right person to go. I had more information about the gauntlet than anyone else in the castle. I knew what I was walking into. I made a calculated decision and it was the right one." He met her eyes. "But I'm telling you what I did and why. Not hiding it." She looked at him for a long time. The torches on the corridor walls threw warm light across her face, and what was in her face was complicated and honest and not entirely classifiable. "Next time," she said finally, "you wait for backup." "If backup is available in the timeframe, yes," Harry said. "If not, Harry, I'll use my best judgment." He looked at her steadily. "Same as tonight." She made a sound that was 3/4 exasperation and 1/4 something else that he thought might be pride, if she'd let it be. "Come on," she said. "Pomfrey." Pomfrey treated his hand with a focused wordlessness that meant she was worried about it and not letting on, then produced a potion that reduced the rawness to a mild warmth, then told him to sleep and meant it. He slept. December came. The sentencing hearing came with it. The Wisengamot assembled in full, all 50 members plus gallery, a formal sentencing session that operated differently from the evidentiary hearing, more structured, more final. Harry attended with Walsh and Pomfrey. He did not testify this time. His testimony was already in the record. He was there as witness to the outcome. Dumbledore was sentenced to 15 years. The actual calculation, 62 counts, compounded by the guardianship abuse and the proxy conspiracy, would have supported far more. The Wisengamot's deliberation had landed at 15 for reasons Walsh explained in the corridor afterward: the genuine complexity of the case, Dumbledore's voluntary guilty plea and cooperation with the subsidiary investigation, and the acknowledgement, controversial among the panel, she said, but ultimately accepted, that the context of the prophecy and the war against Voldemort did not excuse the actions but did contribute to the psychological framework in which they occurred. Walsh had argued for 25. She was professionally unsatisfied. Harry noted this with respect. "Is 15 enough?" Ron had asked, the night before, in the common room. Harry had thought about it honestly. "I don't know what enough looks like," he said. "I don't think there's a number of years that fixes it. 15 is what the process produced. The process was fair." He turned his cup in his hands. "That matters more to me than the number." Ron had looked at him. "You're going to be a very strange adult." "Probably," Harry agreed. In the Wisengamot chamber, watching the sentence delivered, he felt, not satisfaction exactly, and not release in any clean dramatic sense. More like the closing of a formal chapter. The acknowledgement by the structure of the wizarding world that something wrong had been named and measured and assigned consequence. It wasn't the whole story. It was one part of one ongoing story. He wrote that down in his notebook later, in the ministry atrium, waiting for Walsh to emerge from a follow-up procedural meeting. He was sitting on one of the atrium benches and writing, and people were flowing around him in the ordinary ministry way, and he was just a boy sitting on a bench writing in a notebook, which was both the accurate description and not the full picture, in the way that accurate descriptions often weren't. The Guardianship Review Board had formally vacated the 1981 placement decision the previous week. Catriona Walsh had filed 3 follow-on motions. The question of where Harry lived in the long term was still in motion, still being worked through, and he was living at Hogwarts under McGonagall's temporary guardianship, which suited him considerably more than he'd expected. He liked the castle in December. He liked it at 5 in the morning with the fire and the notebook. He liked the way Hermione moved through the library like it was a natural habitat, and the way Ron thought about chess with the specific joy of someone doing the thing they were made for, and the way Neville's hands in the herbology greenhouse had the confidence now of someone who trusted himself to touch things without breaking them. He liked, he thought, checking it carefully for installation, finding it clear, the life he was in the process of constructing. The Philosopher's Stone had been returned to Nicholas Flamel via a ministry-supervised transfer, attended by Walsh and Bones and McGonagall and one Flamel representative who had said very little and observed very carefully. The security arrangements were handled differently this time, without the castle's gauntlet, without the aesthetic of a headmaster's clever protection serving as both defense and lesson. Just clean, direct security by people whose specific job was securing things. Harry had thought it ought to be that way. He had not thought it with particular triumph. Just with the satisfaction of something practical being handled practically. The last thing happened on a Friday evening in mid-December, a week before the Christmas holiday. He was in the library alone, Hermione had gone up early, Ron was playing chess with Seamus, Neville was in the herbology greenhouse, which he visited the way other people visited comfortable rooms. Harry was reading an advanced charms text that was technically 3 years above his level and in practice was keeping him occupied without being too difficult, which he'd found was the right calibration for Friday evenings. He became aware of Draco Malfoy sitting down across the table. He looked up. Malfoy had his own book, a potions reference, and was not immediately speaking. He opened the book, found his page, and began to read. Then, without looking up, the second Quidditch match is in January. I know, Harry said. Flint's going to try to foul you before the snitch is in play. Malfoy turned a page. Slytherin's strategy is to keep the snitch out of your reach for the first half by running interference against the Gryffindor chasers and then disrupting your vision line when it appears. Harry looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Malfoy looked up. The grey eyes were direct, doing their calculating thing, but there was something else in them tonight. The calculation had something behind it that was more honest than usual. Because Flint is 17 and large and our captain, and I told him it was a poor strategy and he told me I was a first year and could mind my own business, Malfoy said. And because the Slytherin strategy since September has been to pretend the first 3 months of this school year didn't happen, and I find that, he paused. Insufficient. Harry watched him. What happened to Potter? You'll soon find that some wizarding families are better than others. Malfoy's jaw tightened. That was 3 months ago. It was 2 months and 3 weeks ago. The point being, Malfoy closed his potions reference with more force than necessary. The wizarding world has spent 11 years telling a specific story about Albus Dumbledore, and within that story certain hierarchies and loyalties and assumptions were fixed. What happened in September broke the story. And when a story breaks, the people who built their positions within it have to. He stopped. His voice had run ahead of his composure. He recalibrated. My father has told me 4 times since the arrest. Each time the letter is different from the last. The certainties are, they're moving. He looked at Harry with something that was probably as close to honesty as Draco Malfoy had been trained to get. I don't know what I think about most things anymore. I thought you should know that. Harry looked at him for a moment. That's actually a reasonable place to be, Harry said. It's uncomfortable. Yes. Most honest places are. Malfoy looked at him. Then he picked up his potions book and opened it again. The interference runs from the left, he said. Flint doesn't trust anyone to manage the right side, so he does it himself. If you come from the east end of the pitch and break toward the center at the right moment, I'll figure it out, Harry said. But thank you. Malfoy nodded once, with a stiffness that was probably the most he could manage. Then he read his potions text and Harry read his charms text, and the library was quiet, and outside the windows December had put the castle in a kind of crystal dark, ice and stars and the lake holding them both. He wrote a letter to Sirius Black that weekend. He'd found Sirius through Walsh, who had found him through the Guardianship Review, which had required a full accounting of the Potter family's available relatives. Sirius Black, godfather, wrongly imprisoned for 12 years in Azkaban on evidence that Catriona Walsh had described to Harry, with the flat voice of contained outrage, as some of the most embarrassing jurisprudence I have reviewed in my professional career. Walsh was working on that too. She was, Harry had concluded, one of the best decisions he'd made in his first year of living as himself. The letter to Sirius was difficult to write, which meant it required 3 drafts and more than 1 cup of tea. He didn't know this man. He had no felt sense of him, no installed loyalty, no compulsion-built affection. Just the facts: his parents had trusted Sirius completely, Sirius had loved them, something had gone catastrophically wrong and the wrong had not been fully interrogated, and there was a man in Azkaban who was connected to Harry's family by every real tie of history and love and circumstance. The 3rd draft started. I don't know what to say to you, and I thought honesty about that was better than pretending otherwise. My name is Harry Potter. I believe you knew my parents. Walsh says the evidence against you doesn't hold. He sent it with Hedwig, who had been patient about the 3 drafts and the extended thinking time, in the particular way that Hedwig was patient about most things, tolerant but aware, like someone who had decided that the person they worked with was worth the complications. He was on the astronomy tower the night before the holiday break, alone in the cold and the dark and the particular silence of a high place, when he felt it settle, all of it, the 3 months. The evidence and the hearings and the clearing treatment and the stone and the 52 things in his notebook and Neville's hands in the greenhouse and Ron across a chessboard and Hermione pressing a book into his hands like it was both gift and challenge. He felt it the way Pomfrey had described, like silence after noise. Like color. The magical recalibration that Brightwater had spoken about was not complete, the treatment would continue for months, the deep architectural signatures still clearing slowly. But something had shifted enough in the last 3 months that when he stood on the astronomy tower and looked out at the grounds and the lake and the dark boundary of the forbidden forest, he felt the magic in him not as something compressed and managed but as something breathing, something alive, something that went all the way down to the floor of him without obstruction. He was not afraid of it. He was not afraid of what was coming, the proxy investigation's continued findings, the guardianship's formal resolution, the question of Sirius Black's exoneration, the question of Voldemort's continued non-corporeal existence and what that meant for the years ahead. He was not afraid of any of it in the way that fear was supposed to work, the way it had worked on him for 10 years when someone else's arrangements had built a boy who stayed where he was put and trusted what he was told to trust and felt what he was designed to feel. He was careful. He was attentive. He was going to make mistakes because he was 11 years old and had been operating on a compulsion-warped version of himself for his entire life, and recalibration was not a clean or simple process. But he was his own. That was the thing. Underneath all the complexity and the legal proceedings and the diagnostic charts and the notebook full of logged incidents, that was the thing that mattered most. He was his own. He had chosen his friends and they were genuinely his friends, chosen freely, and he knew the difference now. He had stood in the Wizengamot and spoken clearly and the words had been his. He had walked into the stone's gauntlet on his own judgment and come out the other side with his own hands. The castle below him breathed its 1,000-year breath. Somewhere in it, McGonagall was working late, which she always was. Pomfrey was in the hospital wing, which she mostly was. Ron was probably talking Seamus into a late-night chess rematch. Hermione was probably reading something she'd categorize as recreational but which would turn out to be academically relevant by morning. Neville was probably in the greenhouse in the dark with the plants that trusted him back now. Harry looked out at the grounds and the sky and the lake that held the stars in its cold black surface like a second sky below, and he thought about the year ahead, the world still uneven and in need of righting, Sirius Black in Azkaban and Voldemort dispersed but not gone, and 100 things in the wizarding world that ran on exactly the kind of comfortable false certainty that had made 62 potions possible in the first place. He thought, I know how to look at things now. I know how to ask the right questions. I know the difference between what I was told to feel and what I actually feel. He thought, that's enough to start with. He put his hands on the cold stone parapet and let the December air move through him, and he was 11 years old and he was entirely himself, and the year stretched ahead like a door that he was going to open on his own terms. The lake held the stars. Harry Potter stood in the dark and breathed.